Welcome to Japan True Stories. Tonight, a quiet story from Japan. Settle in. This is a story from more than 30 years ago, soft with the distance that memory lends to difficult things, and it belongs to a man who is now somewhere in his middle years, married and settled, and still gently surprised, from time to time, by how well everything turned out. He grew up in a sento, a neighborhood public bathhouse, one of those warm and slightly steaming places that were ordinary once in the residential streets of Japanese cities, where people came in the evenings not only to wash, but to arrive somewhere familiar for an hour or two. His was a small one, with a worn wooden entrance, a wall of shoe lockers, a front counter smelling of cedar and warm water, and the low and constant reassurance of water moving somewhere just beyond the curtained doors. Pause. His grandfather sat at the bandai, that raised reception platform from which the old man could see both the men's and women's sides of the bath, and from that high and watching place, the grandfather seemed always to know everything that came through the door. The boy remembered standing below and looking up as a small child, feeling certain, in the wordless way of children, that only a person who had already earned something essential could sit in such a place. His grandfather greeted every regular by name, knew which neighbor had been unwell, knew which elderly woman would talk for 20 minutes if given the room, and knew how to listen in a way that made people feel that what they had said actually mattered. The boy's parents were ordinary company workers who arrived home late most evenings, and so in the practical sense it was his grandparents who raised him, in the warm and faintly humid air of the Sento's entrance hall, between the murmur of the evening news on the small television behind the counter and the soft dripping beyond the curtains. He played baseball in the nearby streets, loved the Yomiuri Giants with the uncomplicated devotion of a boy who has not yet been disappointed by anything important, and came home to his grandmother's cooking and the television broadcast, his older brother beside him on the tatami. Pause. It was an ordinary childhood, good in the small and specific ways that ordinary childhoods are good, and it passed before he quite understood what it was. Then came the second semester of his first year of high school, and with it, a transfer student named Yoshiko. Word had spread through the classroom that the transfer student was a girl, and the boys had allowed themselves a certain quiet expectation, the way 15-year-olds do when the world seems about to offer something interesting. What arrived instead was a girl whose hair was tangled at the ends, whose skin looked pale and tired, whose eyes carried something that might have been exhaustion or might have been the wariness of someone who had learned not to expect much from rooms full of strangers. Her voice, when she introduced herself, was barely audible, and her name appeared in chalk on the blackboard, and she bowed to the class with the careful correctness of someone performing a required duty, and then she took her seat. Pause. And there was something else, something the boy noticed, and that the others noticed too, though no one said it aloud in those first moments, a smell that clung to her clothing and her hair, deep and private, the kind that speaks of many days without the particular relief of warm water. The classroom, which had been cheerful and a little noisy a moment before, grew very quiet. Her desk was across the room from his, and he found himself, privately, relieved at the distance, though it was a relief that would not last long. When the lesson began and the late summer heat pressed in through the walls, someone opened the windows, and the electric fan on its stand turned slowly, and the air began to move through the room from the direction of Yoshiko's desk toward his own. Pause. He lasted until the next break between lessons, then slipped away to the school nurse's room and lay down on the narrow bed behind the white curtain, telling the nurse he felt unwell, which was true in its way, though not in the way he described. Lying there in the pale quiet, he turned the problem over the way a boy turns over something found in the road, not with any clear plan, just with the need to understand what was underneath. And then, in the way that grandparents have of arriving in the mind at the right moment, he heard his grandfather's voice. The old man had said it many times throughout the boy's childhood, in that unhurried and certain way of his. Be honest, live without pretense, do not make yourself into something you are not. Pause. The boy lay on the nurse's bed and thought about the small dishonesty of pretending to be sick, and then thought about the cento, 10 minutes from the school, warm and clean and open every evening, and then a thought arrived that seemed, in the way of 15-year-old thoughts, entirely obvious. He tore a piece of paper from his notebook and wrote something brief, that his family ran a public bath nearby, and that she was welcome to use it, free of charge, and folded it, and left it on Yoshiko's desk during the movement between classes, without signing his name, because he was 15 and some things are easier done than claimed. Breath. He was already back in his seat, looking at the window, when Yoshiko returned, opened the note, and began searching the room for whoever had left it, and when her eyes finally found his, he made a small gesture, a nod, a tilt of the head that meant, simply, come. She held his gaze for a moment with something cautious and wondering in her expression, and then she nodded, once, slowly. After school, he walked through the September streets at the pace of someone trying not to appear to be paying attention to whether anyone was following, and Yoshiko walked some distance behind him, quietly, past the small shop fronts and the smell of cooling pavement and the low sound of late afternoon settling into the neighborhood. The cento was as it always was, the wooden sign above the entry, the faint warmth of steam already drifting through the ventilation gaps, the muffled sound of water from somewhere within the walls. His grandfather was at the counter when they arrived, sitting in his high place with the patience of someone who has held the same position for decades, and the boy explained what he needed, that this girl was new in the area and might want to use the bath, and his grandfather looked at Yoshiko with the open, unhurried attention he gave to everyone who came through his door. He said, warmly and without making anything of it, that she was welcome anytime. Looking back, the man understood that his grandfather had likely seen everything he needed to see in a single quiet glance: Yoshiko's worn coat, her careful posture, the small way she held herself at a slight distance from things, and had known exactly what kind of welcome was required. Pause. Yoshiko went into the women's side, and the boy went into the men's, and he sat in the warm water of that September evening trying to be calm, which was difficult in the particular way that calm is difficult when you have done something unexpectedly kind and do not know what comes next. When Yoshiko emerged, something had changed in her entirely. Her hair was soft and clean, and her face was flushed a warm pink from the heat of the water, and the steam still lingered faintly at her shoulders, and she smelled of the same shampoo the whole family used, and she stood a little straighter, and she looked at him with something open and wondering in her expression, as if meeting him for the very first time. Pause. She thanked him softly and mentioned that the bath had felt wonderful, and he realized neither of them had yet said their names, and so they stood in the cedar-smelling entrance hall and introduced themselves, properly, for the first time. His grandfather suggested he walk Yoshiko home, and the boy agreed, and it would be several years before he understood that his grandfather had offered the suggestion in order to give him a reason to do what he already wanted to do. Breath. He talked about baseball on the way, the Giants, their recent season, a particular game he had described to his brother at least 4 times already, and Yoshiko mentioned that her family had always been Giants fans as well, and something in the air between them eased and warmed, and by the time they reached her grandmother's house the nervousness between them had become something simpler and more pleasant. Her grandmother appeared at the door, a small, quick-eyed woman with the kind of humor that comes from paying close attention to people for many years, and she looked at the boy and said something teasing about first days and boyfriends, and Yoshiko said it was nothing like that, and the old woman smiled in a way that suggested she was not quite convinced. Pause. The grandmother mentioned, without apology, that things had been difficult recently, that baths had not always been possible, and the boy told her she was welcome at the cento too, any evening, and the grandmother laughed and said that such an invitation from a polite young man was not something she could refuse. The following afternoon, his grandfather called the boy over before the evening rush and mentioned, with the gentle indirectness of a man who understood how to give people things without making them feel they were receiving charity, that his wife's knees had been troubling her, that someone to help with the cleaning of the women's bath would be very useful, and that such a person would naturally be welcome to use the baths whenever she liked. Pause. The boy looked at his grandfather and understood exactly what was being arranged, and when he brought the proposal to Yoshiko at school the next morning, she received it with a brightness and surprise that he had not seen in her before, a quick, unguarded delight. The kind that arrives when something you have needed very much appears from somewhere you had not thought to look. She confided that she had always loved baths, that she had missed them more than she could quite explain to anyone her age. From that week onward, Yoshiko came to the sento every afternoon after school, learned the work quietly and quickly, and the grandfather appreciated her steadiness in the plain way that experienced people appreciate useful things, by saying less and trusting more. Pause. Within a month, she had friends at school where before she had had none, and her posture had changed, and she moved through the hallways with less of that careful holding herself in that the boy had noticed on her very first day. Her grandmother became a regular at the sento as well, arriving certain evenings and falling into easy conversation with the grandfather, who was close in age, and they had the uncomplicated friendship of people who have lived long enough to know that warmth is worth offering without delay. The boy watched all of this from a comfortable distance, Yoshiko learning the routines, arriving each afternoon with the quiet purpose of someone who has found where they belong, and he told himself he was simply glad the plan had worked, though the truth of what he was feeling was already, slowly, becoming something else. Breath. Winter arrived, and with it a small television crew from the local station, who had heard that the sento was among the oldest still operating in that district and wished to film it. His grandfather gave his interview from the high counter with the contained dignity of a man who has spent 40 years doing something well and is quietly grateful, at last, to have it noticed. The family gathered around the television on the broadcast evening, even the boy's father, who had rearranged his work schedule to be home, and there was the sento on the screen, and there was the grandfather's face, warm and a little proud, and then the camera moved through the women's bath and came to rest on Yoshiko, who was in the middle of arranging the wooden washing buckets, absorbed in her work, unaware of being filmed, the lamplight falling across the side of her face in a way that the boy found rather difficult to look at casually. Pause. He spent the next several minutes being very careful about where he directed his attention. The following day at school, the rumors had already begun, imprecise and growing with each retelling, in the way that rumors do, taking on a shape that suited each person's imagination more than it suited the facts. Several classmates had decided that because Yoshiko appeared on television in the boys' family's sento, there must be some kind of romance, and the more he tried to explain that she simply worked there, the more convincing the rumor seemed to become, in the peculiar logic of hallways and lunch hours. For a week or so after that, there was a careful formality between the two of them. They spoke less, were more precise with each other, as if both were being very cautious near something that might spill if handled carelessly. Pause. One evening, he bought 2 bottles of coffee milk from the vending machine outside the sento, that sweet and cold particular treat that belongs entirely to the hour after a bath, and waited for Yoshiko when her shift ended. They walked home together in the early dark, past the lit shop windows and the smell of dinner from behind closed doors, and he told her he was sorry if the television broadcast had caused her any difficulty. She replied softly that it had not bothered her, that she was grateful for everything his family had given her, that the sento had changed her life in ways she found difficult to put simply into words. And then, because he was 15 and had been circling something for several weeks without quite being able to name it, He said something about how it would be a shame if some misunderstanding caused trouble with whoever she actually had feelings for. Pause. Yoshiko stopped walking. He turned, and she was standing very still on the pavement, and the amber light from a nearby shop window fell across her face, and her expression was something he had not seen before, open and earnest and, underneath those things, a little frightened. What she said next came out barely above a whisper, something to the effect that the person she had feelings for was him. He stood for a long moment without speaking, not quite believing what he had heard, and asked her to say it again, and she did, more clearly this time, and then turned and made her way toward her grandmother's house at a pace that left no room for immediate response. He stood on the pavement for one more second, and then followed. Pause. She was at her door when he caught up, had stopped there, was not going in, was simply standing and waiting, and he told her that he felt the same way, that he had felt the same way for some time. She turned around and held out her hand toward him, very formally, as though they were meeting for the very first time, and asked him to please take care of her. He took her hand and said the same thing back, and that was the beginning. Breath. His grandfather mentioned later over tea, on a quiet afternoon, that he had noticed the way the boy looked at Yoshiko almost from the first week she came, and had simply waited, with the patience of a man who has watched a great many things unfold from a high counter. The remaining years of high school passed in the way that good years pass, not slowly enough, and full of the particular warmth that comes from being young and near someone you care about, and not yet understanding how rare that combination is. After graduation, the boy went on to university and then to his father's company. Yoshiko worked steadily at the Sento, at a convenience store, caring for her grandmother and building, quietly, the structure of a life. Pause. Yoshiko's grandmother grew slowly older, and before she passed she told Yoshiko, who would share this years later, in a quiet evening at home, in the way people share things they have been holding carefully for a long time, that meeting the boy and his grandfather had changed her life, that she had found something warm and unexpected in that neighborhood, and that Yoshiko should keep him close and never take for granted what she had been given. The man, now in his middle years, found that this story still moved him whenever it came back to him, not from grief exactly, but from the feeling that arrives when you understand, only gradually and only much later, how much was given to you before you were old enough to know you were receiving it. Yoshiko and the man married not long after, quietly, in the way of people who already know each other completely and require no ceremony to confirm it. Pause. The Sento passed to the older brother, who kept it going, who still kept it going, even now, the steam still rising on winter evenings, the neighborhood still finding its way there in the comfortable way that people find their way to places that have always been open. 20 years of marriage had settled around them like a season that had always felt right, and Yoshiko was still the same in the ways that mattered most, patient, gentle, present in a way that required no announcement. Even now, when the man passed a Sento somewhere in the city, and they were rarer now, those places, as many old things grow rarer, he would pause outside for a moment, and the smell of the steam and the cedar and the warm water would bring the whole long sequence of it back. The note left on a desk, the walk through the September streets, the coffee milk shared in the early dark, the hand held out in the lamplight. Pause. He thought, on those occasions, that he would like for anyone who had ever felt out of place or overlooked to find, somewhere nearby, a warm door that opened without conditions. Perhaps that was what his grandfather had always understood, that the most important thing you can offer another person is sometimes simply warmth, and a clean and quiet place to begin again. And the story rests there, gently, in the steam of a long-ago winter evening, and in the ordinary supper being kept warm tonight, without fuss, by the woman who once walked into a neighborhood center with nothing certain and everything uncertain, and simply never left. Long pause. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade, the way all memories do, softly, like breath against a cold window. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take it, let your shoulders settle, let your hands grow heavy, let the quiet fill the spaces between your thoughts. You are safe here, and the night is long, and there is nowhere else you need to be. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a gentle thing, distant and warm, like candlelight seen from across a room. When you are ready, it will be waiting for you, just ahead, just beyond this breath. She and her classmate arrived at the nursing home on a morning when the sky was the color of still water, low and pale and unhurried, the kind of morning that seems content to simply be what it is without asking anything of the people moving through it. The building stood only a few minutes from the station along a quiet residential street, a modest structure of beige concrete softened by age and a small garden where the maple near the entrance had already begun its slow seasonal reddening, one leaf at a time. She was nervous, though she would not have described it that way out loud. It was the quiet, interior kind of nervousness that settles in the body rather than announcing itself, a gentle tightening just below the sternum that made even familiar objects feel slightly unfamiliar. Her classmate had sensed this without needing to be told, the way some people do when they have known someone long enough to read the silences between words as easily as the words themselves. He had talked a little more warmly than usual on the train, filling the space her quiet left, and she had listened with half her attention while the other half moved through the window and across the low autumn rooftops and the white morning sky beyond them. At the entrance, a staff member welcomed them with the unhurried warmth of someone entirely at ease in this world, and they were shown to a small side room where they traded their school clothes for pale blue work uniforms and sat side by side on a low bench while someone explained, carefully and without rushing, what would be asked of them over the coming days. The duties were modest and human, carrying meal trays and collecting them again, drying residents' hair after their afternoon baths, light cleaning and tidying, and most importantly, the simple offering of presence, to sit, to listen, to be available without agenda. Her classmate brightened visibly at this, his whole posture loosening into the easy readiness of someone returning to familiar ground, and she noted with a kind of quiet admiration how naturally this world seemed to receive him. She reminded herself, without quite knowing why, that she had been a different person once, in what she thought of privately as her other life, and that perhaps there was some kind of competence still in her that she simply had not yet located. The morning began, and she entered it carefully. Meal service came first, and she took it more seriously than was perhaps necessary, checking and rechecking the name cards on each tray with the concentrated attention of someone who wants, above everything else, not to make a mistake that will cause someone's day to go wrong in some small but irreversible way. She settled beside an elderly woman at one of the low tables and helped bring spoonfuls of food slowly to her lips, and her hands shook at first with a fine invisible trembling that came not from cold but from the awareness of another person's fragility held in her own not quite steady hands. The woman had looked at those hands, and then up at her face, and smiled, the wide unself-conscious smile of someone who has long since stopped considering what their smile looks like from the outside, and said something quietly grateful that landed in the room like a small warmth. After that, the trembling steadied. Her classmate was moving among the tables with the ease of someone who had never been taught to be awkward in the presence of age, pausing at each resident to exchange a word or a small observation, his voice dropping naturally into a register of warm attention that made people lean toward him as plants lean toward a window. She watched him from her corner of the room and felt something between admiration and relief, grateful for the way his presence seemed to lift the atmosphere of the entire room without requiring anything particular from her. The hair drying, which came later in the day, turned out to be a task she was unexpectedly good at, perhaps because she had been managing her own long hair since she was old enough to take responsibility for it, and the motion of guiding a dryer in slow arcs above someone's head was as practiced and unthinking for her as breathing. She worked without hurrying, letting the warm air move through an elderly woman's silver hair while the woman sat with her eyes softly closed and her shoulders in the posture of someone who is, for this one moment, entirely unburdened. The room at that hour smelled of clean water and something faintly floral, a soap or a lotion she could not identify, and through the window the autumn garden held its small and particular stillness, a maple just outside the glass moving almost imperceptibly in a light wind that she could not hear. Her classmate had adopted an approach of absolute caution with the hairdryer, she noticed, holding it at what could only be described as a ceremonial distance from every strand, using the lowest heat setting with the solemnity of someone performing a task that cannot be undone, and one of the elderly men in his care had laughed softly at this careful slowness and said something that made her classmate grin. The afternoon came gradually, the way autumn afternoons arrive in Japan, without announcement, settling over a room by degrees, the light growing horizontal and golden across the low tables, the pace of everything slowing of its own natural accord. The residents moved into a time of rest and easy conversation, and she and her classmate drifted among them, listening more than speaking, which she came to feel was the more useful skill in this place. She heard stories she had not known to expect about neighborhoods that had changed beyond recognition, about foods and festivals and small ordinary moments that had been held in someone's memory for 60 or 70 years and were still as clear and immediate as if they had happened the previous afternoon. There was a quality to these tellings that surprised her, not the nostalgia of someone grieving what was lost, but something gentler and more settled, as though the past were a room one had always been fond of and still visited occasionally in the mind, without wishing to move back into it. She found herself drawn into these stories more fully than she had anticipated, losing track of time in the way one does when genuine interest has overtaken everything else. Some of the words the residents used, certain place names, certain turns of phrase, struck a chord in her that she could not quite locate, as though they referred to something she had almost known once, in some version of a life she could no longer clearly see from this side of things. It was while she was listening to a long meandering story about a summer journey someone had taken to the coast that she became aware, without knowing precisely how, of the old man sitting alone near the window at the far end of the room. He was settled in a low armchair positioned slightly apart from the others, his gaze directed outward through the glass to wherever the garden ended and the autumn sky began, his hands resting quietly on his knees in the posture of someone who has traveled a long way inward and arrived somewhere very still. She had noticed him, she supposed, for the same reason one sometimes notices the single thing in a room that is not in motion, the eye drawn to stillness the way it is drawn to a particular quality of light. A staff member had leaned down to speak to him earlier in the afternoon, quietly and without urgency, and he had replied with a word or two, not unkindly, she had thought, but with the manner of someone who is answering from a great distance and would prefer, once the answer is given, to return to where they were. One of the residents nearby spoke his name, Shiro-san, and mentioned, in the offhand way of someone describing something that has already become familiar, that he had been different some months ago, more present and engaged, and that his memory had been blurring at the edges recently, which sometimes made him seem to inhabit two places at once. She looked at him from across the length of the common room and felt something she could not straightforwardly name, not quite recognition, and not quite concern, but something that sat gently between those two feelings and pressed against her from the inside in a way that was not unpleasant. She excused herself from the conversation she had been part of and walked slowly toward where he sat, making no announcement of her approach, simply arriving quietly at the edge of his line of vision and waiting there in the warmth of the afternoon light that fell through the window. She introduced herself the way they had been taught, softly and with her name, explaining that she was a student from the local high school here for the week, and that she and her classmate were moving among the residents to make sure everyone was comfortable. Shiro-san did not look at her immediately, and she stood and waited without any sense that she was owed his attention before he was ready to offer it. She mentioned after a moment that some of the residents were getting ready for a card game, and wondered aloud whether he might like to join them. And then, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone surfacing from deep water, Shiro-san turned toward her. She would think about this moment many times afterward, and what she would always remember was not any outward drama, there was none, but the quality of the stillness in his face in the instant before he spoke, the way his gaze settled on her and stayed there, as though he were looking at something he had not expected to find in this room on this ordinary autumn afternoon. His eyes were clear and dark, and in them she saw something she could only describe afterward, to herself, as the expression of someone who has been reading a long and difficult book and has come, quite suddenly, upon a passage they recognize as though they had written it. He breathed, and his expression shifted, something in it opening and then quietly closing again, the way a door moves in a room where there is almost no wind. He said softly, after a moment, that she reminded him of someone, an old acquaintance, or someone who had been one, he could not quite say who, only that the resemblance had startled him, and he murmured something apologetic about staring, with a small and contained smile. She told him it was perfectly all right, and she meant it, and as she said so she felt in her chest a small quiet knock, not alarm, but a kind of heightened attention, as though something in her were leaning toward a sound it had almost heard before and was trying to hear again. After that, the afternoon found its own ease, and Shiro-san came to the card table after all, lowering himself into a chair across from her with the careful unhurriedness of someone managing a body that no longer moves quite as freely as it once did, and they played through the remaining hours in a warmth that had not been in the room before he arrived. The other residents moved in and out of the game, someone refilled the tea without being asked, a brief disagreement over a card was resolved with soft laughter, and the light outside the windows shifted by slow degrees from afternoon gold to the cooler, quieter color of early evening, and none of it was hurried or asked to be other than what it was. She watched Shiro-san's face when he was not watching hers, and noticed the way he smiled when a round went well, a contained, inward smile, the kind that lives inside a person rather than being directed outward at anyone, and felt the pull of that smile in some part of herself she could not precisely locate. Several of the staff members remarked quietly to one another that they had not seen him this way in weeks, and in their voices there was a small careful relief that she absorbed without yet knowing what to do with it. The day ended in the way that days end in places where the hour is measured by comfort rather than productivity, slowly and without fanfare, and she and her classmate made their way back through the early evening streets to the station, the city already beginning to turn on its lights as they went. She was quieter than usual on the train, and knew it, and made no effort to disguise it, because she was occupied with something inside herself, trying to place a feeling that had no obvious location, turning it over gently the way one turns over something found on the floor of a room one thought one knew well. Her classmate sat beside her and waited, and when the silence had gone on long enough to have meaning, he asked, in the oblique and easy way he had, whether she was tired, phrasing it so it sounded like a joke but was not quite one. She looked out at the dark shapes of buildings moving past the window, and then she decided, for reasons she did not fully examine, to tell him something she had not told anyone in quite this way, and she asked him, carefully and without preamble, whether he believed in past lives. He looked at her with a surprise that was genuine and unguarded, his expression open in a way she had not expected, and then something in him settled into a kind of readiness. He turned toward her the way he did when he actually intended to listen, which she had always found to be one of his more reliable qualities. She told him what she had kept largely private for years, that she had had, from earliest childhood, fragments of memory that seemed to belong to a life other than this one, images and feelings that did not correspond to anything in her actual history, loose and faded but persistent, like the impression a heavy book leaves on a soft surface long after the book itself has been moved. She described how she had spoken, when very small, with a fluency that had bewildered her parents, and how she had occasionally simply walked out of the house as though she had somewhere to be, some appointment she had made long ago and not yet cancelled. She told him that she had grown up and the memories had faded in the way that certain kinds of dreams fade, not suddenly, but gradually, the way the last light of a day fades into evening without one being able to name the exact moment it became dark. But today, she said, sitting across from Shiro-san at that low table with the afternoon moving across the walls, she had felt something stir that she could not dismiss, the echo of a recognition, the impression of a face she had seen before, not in this life but in some other season of being that she could no longer clearly reach from where she now stood. Her classmate was quiet for a moment after she finished, and she waited for the polite withdrawal that sometimes comes when someone is handed something they do not know how to hold without dropping it. But when she looked at him, his expression was not closed at all, it was, in fact, extraordinarily open, lit from within by a wondering and genuine curiosity that certain people carry with them as naturally as others carry doubt. He told her that he believed her, and then, to her considerable surprise, he told her something in return, that when he was around 2 years old, he had told his mother, in apparent earnestness, that he had come down through a brightness he could not describe and found his way into warmth, and that he remembered the gentle floating softness of being inside her before the world had assigned him a name or a body he knew how to use. His mother still mentioned it sometimes, he said, with a quiet fondness that had never entirely resolved into simple dismissal, and he had grown up holding it lightly, neither insisting on it nor letting it go, the way one holds something small and not entirely explicable. She stared at him for a moment, and then something in her chest loosened, the particular kind of loosening that comes when something carried in private is met not with disbelief but with an openness that asks nothing in return. They rode the rest of the way in a warmth that had not been there on the journey out, talking a little and then not talking, the city moving past the windows in its ordinary evening way, the train swaying softly on its familiar tracks. She said goodbye at the station and walked home through the last of the autumn light, past a small park where the trees were just beginning to release their leaves one by one, past shopfronts lit with the ordinary comfortable yellow of a weekday evening. She thought, as she walked, about Shiro-san's face in the moment it had turned toward her through the stillness of that room, and she found that the feeling the memory carried had not grown smaller with the distance of the afternoon, but had instead settled into something she could hold without effort, something worn smooth by a kind of handling she did not yet fully understand. She arrived at her front door and let herself in, and the house smelled of dinner and warmth, and everything was exactly as it always was, and she was glad for that. That night, lying in the softness of her room with the light off and the sounds of the house settling gently around her, she let the faces of the day drift through her thoughts without trying to arrange them into anything that made sense. The elderly woman who had smiled at her trembling hands, the hum of the dryer, the afternoon light across the card table, the tea someone had poured without being asked, and Shiro-san's face, turning toward her slowly through the stillness of that room, familiar and entirely new at once. She let those thoughts move through her without holding any of them, and eventually, as thoughts do when they are left to themselves long enough, they grew quieter and quieter, and she followed them gently down into sleep. And that, for the first day, was enough. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet shadows folding gently away, like the last page of a letter you have already read twice. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one, let your breath settle, slow and easy, the way still water finds its level all on its own. Feel the weight of your body, the warmth of where you are lying, and let it hold you. When you are ready, and there is truly no rush, our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a soft and distant thing, the way certain faces return to us just before sleep, unhurried, unburdened, simply present. So the spring came, as it always does, softly and without announcement, and with it came the new chapter of his life, the small apartment he had rented on the edge of the university district, 3 train stops from the family home where his mother and stepfather now settled into their quiet life together. He had chosen a place on the 2nd floor, modest and clean, with a single window that looked out over a narrow street where a vending machine hummed through the night, its amber glow the only warm thing visible from his futon when he lay awake in those first weeks, listening to the strangeness of sleeping alone. He had imagined relief. Pause. He had told himself, many times over the final months of high school, that once he was away from the household, away from the commotion of her presence, away from the unannounced visits to his room and the relentless teasing and the way she made the whole house feel too small for him, he would finally breathe. And he did breathe. Breath. The mornings were quiet, and the evenings were his own, and he could leave his things exactly where he placed them and find them exactly there the following day. It was, in almost every measurable way, the solitude he had wished for. The first week, he organized his shelves twice and sat at his window in the evenings watching the street below, learning the sounds of the building, the pipes settling at night, the neighbor's television through the thin wall, the particular silence that arrived just after midnight, and feeling the new, unfamiliar weight of a life that was entirely his own. The messages arrived on the 3rd day. He was sitting at his low table with a bowl of instant rice and a textbook open beside it when his phone lit up with her name, and he remembers, or at least he would later remember, the small, complicated feeling that rose in him before he had even read the words. She asked whether he was eating properly. In that way she had, the question half playful and half genuinely concerned, the kind of question that came dressed in teasing but held something warmer underneath. He replied that he was fine, that the apartment was fine, that everything was fine. Pause. The reply came back in under a minute, and it said that she was lonely, and that he had better not be ignoring her, and that she missed having someone to talk to in the evenings. He set the phone face down and went back to his textbook. The vending machine hummed in the street. A motorbike passed below. The night was quiet and ordinary, and he told himself, very carefully, that this was what he had wanted. The messages continued the next day, and the day after that. Breath. She sent them at all hours, a photograph of a convenience store dessert she had found appealing, a complaint about the drizzle, a question about whether he had found a good ramen shop near the university yet, a follow-up when he did not answer, and then another follow-up, cheerful and insistent, asking if he had somehow lost his phone. He told himself she was simply like this had always been her way, filling silences the way some people fill rooms, effortlessly and without particular intention, as though quiet were something that simply had not occurred to her. And yet he noticed, too, that he read every one of them, even the trivial ones, the photograph of a cloud formation she found interesting, the observation about a song she had heard on the train platform, and that reading them was not, entirely, a burden. There was something in the rhythm of it that he could not quite bring himself to silence, though he would not have admitted that at the time. And yet the messages were different from the barging through his door, different from the cheerful chaos of sharing a household. Pause. They arrived gently, one at a time, and he could choose when to read them, and he could take his time before responding, and somehow in that small buffer of distance they felt he would struggle later to find the right word, less overwhelming, perhaps, and more like something else he did not yet have a name for. The first visit came about 6 weeks after he had moved in. She had been out with colleagues from the company she had joined the year before, and the train home, she mentioned, was tiresome, and his apartment happened to be closer to the izakaya, the small neighborhood restaurant bar, than her own place was, and surely he would not mind, she said, if she came up for just a little while. He opened the door to find her in a light jacket over her work clothes, carrying a small bag from a convenience store, and wearing the expression of someone who had already decided that the answer was yes before the question had properly been asked. She came in and settled onto the floor cushion he kept beside the low table, and she opened the bag and produced 2 canned coffees and a packet of almond biscuits, and she began talking, the way she always talked, with the easy confidence of someone who assumed the room was glad to have her. He listened. He made a sound or two that suggested he was following along. He looked at her across the low table in the lamplight of his small apartment and felt, somewhere underneath the familiar exasperation, something he recognized dimly as gladness. He did not examine this gladness too closely. He had learned, by then, that examining it too closely only made things more confusing. She stayed later than she had suggested she would, though this was not a surprise. She told a story about a client at her company who had sent the wrong document 3 times in a row and expected everyone to be grateful for the effort. She laughed at her own telling of it, and the laughter was quiet in the way laughter is when people are tired and comfortable, not the kind that startles. He found himself laughing too, a little, in spite of himself. She left close to midnight, tucking the empty cans into his recycling bin without being asked, and he watched her put on her shoes in the small entryway and thought that there was something unexpectedly careful about the way she did it, one shoe, then the other, precise and unhurried. She told him to lock up properly. He told her to get home safely. These were, he would think later, the most ordinary words they had ever exchanged. She had stayed perhaps 2 hours, and after she left he washed the 2 mugs and set them on the drying rack, and the apartment settled back into its usual quiet, and he sat at the low table for a while, not doing anything in particular, simply sitting. The visits became a pattern through the autumn months, appearing unannounced, sometimes after a long day at her office, sometimes on a weekend afternoon when she was passing through that part of the city and decided, with the breezy logic she applied to most decisions, that stopping in was simply the most reasonable thing to do. He would have said, if anyone had asked, that it was tiresome. He never quite got around to saying that when she was actually there. The apartment itself seemed to change slightly when she was in it, not larger exactly, but fuller, the way a room feels when a window has been opened and the outside air has come in. He noticed this without comment and said nothing about it, even to himself. The leaves on the ginkgo trees along the avenue near his building turned that steady, particular shade of gold that mid-autumn brings, and he walked through fallen ones on his way to the station in the mornings, and the season moved through its changes the way seasons do, without asking permission. There was an evening in October, the kind of October evening in Tokyo when the air has finally given up pretending it is still summer, and the smell of the city changes, becomes something cooler and slightly metallic, like rain coming from far away, when she arrived in a mood he had not quite seen before. She had been at a small restaurant near Shinjuku with several colleagues, she told him, a work gathering to celebrate a project that had finished well, and the evening had been pleasant, and the sake had been pleasant, and things had stretched longer than anyone had planned, and here she was. She was a little looser in her movements than usual, a little more expansive, and he could tell without asking that the evening had gone on longer than she had intended, and that she had judged herself steady enough for the journey and had perhaps judged slightly generously. She settled onto the floor cushion and asked for water, and he brought it, and she thanked him with exaggerated sincerity and drank it in long, careful sips. Then she said something that he had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, to have said out loud. She observed, in the tone she used when she was pretending a thing was casual, that they were not actual siblings, and that while they had been living under the same roof there had been good reasons for restraint, because she had not wanted to worry their parents, but that this was his apartment and their parents were not here, and perhaps it was worth acknowledging that the usual reasons for restraint did not entirely apply. He looked at her across the low table for a long moment, and the radiator made a small ticking sound in the quiet, and somewhere below in the street a bicycle passed. Pause. He pointed out that she had perhaps had more to drink than she was letting on. He noted, searching for the word as he spoke it, that this was not a straightforward situation, that she was his stepsister, whatever the technical details of their relationship, and that there were some feelings a person could not simply set aside because of logistics. She listened to this with her hands around the water glass and her eyes on the table, and when he finished she was quiet for a little while. She said, softly, that she had not meant to make things difficult. She said that she had started out, truly, with every intention of being nothing more than a pleasant older sister to him, and that this had been her genuine intention in those first months. But she had watched him, over time, grow into someone she had not anticipated, steadier, more present, more himself, and the feeling had arrived without her permission and had proved unwilling to leave when she asked it to. She admitted, in a quieter voice still, that it was embarrassing to say these things plainly. She mentioned that she was not, as a rule, someone who found honesty about tender feelings easy, whatever impression she might give to the contrary with her easy manner and her confidence in other parts of her life. He sat with this. The vending machine hummed in the street outside. The radiator ticked. The small apartment was very quiet. He told her he was not certain what to say. He told her, as honestly as he could manage, that he had spent considerable effort over the past year convincing himself that whatever he felt when she walked into a room was simply the ordinary discomfort of an introverted person around someone very loud, and that dismantling that particular conviction was going to take him a moment. She looked at him then, and for the first time in all the months he had known her, she looked genuinely unsure of herself. Pause. It was a small expression, there and then covered, but he saw it the way her certainty stepped back, just briefly, to reveal something underneath that was softer and more tentative and rather younger than she usually allowed the world to see. He felt, in that moment, that he had perhaps not understood the weight of what she had been carrying through all those cheerful, exhausting months. She gathered herself quietly and told him not to worry, that she would manage her own feelings quite adequately, and that he should sleep well and not think too hard about any of it. And then she found the spare blanket he kept folded on the shelf without being shown where it was. She had always had that quality, a sense for where things were kept even in spaces she had barely visited, and she settled onto the narrow sofa and told him good night in a voice that was already more than halfway to sleep. He stood for a moment in the low light, watching her, and then turned off the lamp and went to his own room and lay on his futon in the dark, and the city made its small nighttime sounds outside the window. He lay there thinking about what she had said, and what he had said, and the expression he had seen on her face in the moment just after she had spoken, that brief, unguarded softness, and he thought about all the months she had been carrying that feeling through their comfortable, ridiculous daily collisions, and the thought was heavier than he had expected. Sleep came slowly that night. But it came. In the early morning, before he had fully surfaced from sleep, he heard the soft sound of the apartment door closing. By the time he got up and looked, she was gone, and the spare blanket was folded back on the shelf where it had been, and on the low table there was a note, just 4 words, in her handwriting, which was rounder and more careful than he had expected from someone who moved through the world as confidently as she did, and the note said only, "Thank you for listening." He stood in his small apartment in the early grey light, holding the note, and outside the window the city was beginning its day, the street sounds starting up again, someone's radio, the rumble of a delivery truck, the distant chime of a crosswalk signal somewhere nearby. He set the note on the table. Pause. He was not quite sure what he felt. Or rather, he was beginning to suspect that he was quite sure what he felt, and that this was the difficulty, that clarity, when it finally arrives, is not always the comfortable thing a person imagines it will be. And so the morning passed as mornings do, in ordinary increments, and he made tea in the small kitchen and watched the light change slowly on the buildings across the street, and he did not reach for his phone, and neither, for the first time in months, did it reach for him. The silence between them, when it came in the days after, would last longer than he expected. Breath, he would find, in those quiet weeks, that silence has its own texture, that the absence of her messages in the mornings was a different kind of sound, a kind of negative hum, the shape of something that had been present and was not anymore. And that absence would teach him something about himself that all those months of wishing for quiet had not managed to teach him before. But that is a story for the next part of the evening, and the night is still long, and there is no need to hurry toward it. Pause. For now, it is enough to rest here, in the amber light of that small autumn apartment, with the last of the season at the window and the faint sound of rain just beginning to fall. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its sounds and shadows dissolve slowly, the way a dream dissolves when morning is still far away. There is no hurry here. If you need to settle a little deeper into your pillow, to let your breath find its own quiet rhythm, this is exactly the moment for that. Take a slow breath now, in through the nose, and let it go. The night holds all the time in the world. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a gentle thing, soft at the edges, the kind of remembrance that asks nothing of you except that you listen, and rest, and drift a little further into the dark. Somewhere in the weeks that followed the fireworks and the first long night of conversation, the visits to Tomoko's house became, quietly and without any particular announcement, a kind of rhythm in Ichi's weeks. He would arrive in the early evening, slipping his shoes off in the small entrance hall, and Tomoko's mother would call from the kitchen that she was nearly finished and he should go through and sit down and make himself comfortable. The living room had a particular smell he came to know well over those weeks, something like slow-cooked broth and aging wood, and a faint trace of the incense she kept lit near the small memorial shelf in the corner of the room. It would settle over him each time he came through the door, the way certain familiar smells do, not loudly but all at once, and he found he had come to associate it with a feeling he could only describe as being allowed to be quiet. For a while, the three of them would sit together, Tomoko and her mother and Ichi, with the television murmuring at a low volume while dishes moved gently across the low table and conversations drifted and turned and found their own way home. Then in September, Tomoko mentioned she had taken a part-time job at a neighborhood izakaya, the kind of place that stayed open until well past midnight, and after that the shape of the evenings shifted slightly, and it was often just Ichi and her mother at the table with 2 cups instead of 3. He had expected that change to feel awkward, that reduction to just the 2 of them, but it did not feel awkward at all, and he found himself wondering at that, the ease of it, how uncomplicated the quietness could be with the right person sitting across from you. Breath. Tomoko's mother was someone who knew how to fill a room with conversation, not in any loud or demanding way, but with warmth and a kind of thoughtful looseness, moving from one subject to the next in the easy way of a person who simply enjoys the company of ideas and does not need them to go anywhere in particular. She would tell him stories from her younger years, of a summer she had spent working in a small shop in Kyoto, of a teacher from her middle school days who had possessed the most careful brushwork she had ever seen and who had written letters to parents that looked, she said, like small paintings framed in ink. She told him about Tomoko as a child, about a phase when Tomoko had decided, at some young and determined age, to take full responsibility for making her own lunch, and had produced something involving rice and pickled plum and an amount of sesame oil that the household had not quite recovered from for several days afterward. These stories came without artifice, without the careful arrangement of someone performing warmth for a guest, and he liked that about them, liked the way they arrived like things simply remembered, pulled naturally up from wherever real memories rest when they are not being thought about. Pause. Ichi would listen with his hands loosely around his cup, laughing softly when she laughed, asking a question when she paused, sometimes just nodding slowly in a way he hoped communicated that she had his full and unhurried attention. He had always been, by nature, more comfortable on the listening side of any conversation, more at ease holding the shape of someone else's story than with the effort of constructing his own, and he found that quality in himself was, sitting here, entirely and perfectly useful. October came, and with it the particular quality of Japanese autumn that turns everything amber-edged and slightly slower, the light arriving at a lower angle through the paper screens and the evenings shortening until darkness had settled in before dinner even began. November followed in its own grey and unhurried way, and the windows of the living room began to hold the cold against their surfaces in the evenings, and the ceramic sake cups felt warmer in the hands than they had in the weeks before. Breath. It was somewhere in November that he began to notice something he had not noticed before, or perhaps had noticed and not quite allowed himself to look at directly. There were moments in the evenings when Tomoko's mother would grow quiet in a way that was different from the easy, comfortable quiet of a person who has simply paused, different in some quality beneath the surface that he could not immediately name, a kind of absence within her presence. A small shadow would pass across her face, lasting only a moment, long enough to register and then gone, replaced by whatever came next, a refilled cup or a return to the thread of some interrupted story or a glance toward the kitchen where something might need attending. He noticed it more as December approached, the shadow visiting more often, and he would watch it come and go with the careful attention of someone who cares about what he observes and does not yet know what to do with what he sees. Pause. He was not sure for several weeks whether to say anything, because there is a kind of attention that can feel like intrusion if it arrives before the other person is ready for it, and he did not want to make her feel observed in a way that made her close. But one evening in early December, when condensation had begun to gather at the corners of the window glass and the cold outside had taken on the particular weight of that season, the shadow on her face stayed longer than it usually did. It stayed through a small silence, and through her reaching for her cup, and through a moment when she looked toward the window at nothing in particular, and he found himself, before he had quite decided to, asking whether something was weighing on her. She looked at him with genuine surprise, the kind that is not performed, and asked softly what had made him notice, and he told her only that there had been moments recently when she seemed to be somewhere else, and that he had found himself wondering about it. She was quiet for a little while, turning her sake cup slowly in both hands, and then she said, in a voice that was careful and unhurried, that she supposed it was about her husband. Pause. He waited without speaking, and she continued in her own time, in her own way. He had known, from something Tomoko had mentioned months ago in passing, that the household was just the two of them, mother and daughter, but the circumstances of how that had come to be had never been spoken of directly, and he had not asked. She told him, choosing her words with a measured pace, that her husband had died 10 years ago, in December, when he had been on his way home from work and a car had come without warning and the evening had ended before it was supposed to. She did not elaborate on the details of the accident itself, and he did not ask her to, understanding from the careful way she described it that she had long since decided which parts of that story she was willing to enter and which parts she had learned to leave at a certain distance. Long pause. Tomoko had been in primary school at the time, she remembered, at the age when children understand loss in fragments, when they know that something essential is absent but do not yet have the full weight of it to carry all at once. Her mother recalled the way she had moved through those first months, arriving each morning at the next necessary thing, the packed lunch for Tomoko's school bag, the early shift at work, the grocery list, the dinner that needed making and then the dishes after, and then the morning again. She noted, quietly, that in some ways the relentlessness of those days had been a kind of mercy, because there was not enough space in them for her to stop and fully consider the size of what had changed. Breath. Her own parents had helped, and her husband's family when they could, Though both lived some distance away and there was only so much that could be arranged from a distance, only so much that proximity can be substituted by goodwill and telephone calls. She had received a promotion around that time, she observed, with a small wry softness in her voice, as though the timing had been the particular kind of irony that you can only regard with a gentle shrug from the distance of years. But she had used the job as a way to build something reliable for Tomoko, something that would hold the shape of their life steady in the ways that mattered, and she would not regret the hours she had put into it, even the ones that had cost her other things. What she did feel, sometimes, especially as Tomoko grew and the urgent pressing forward of single parenthood slowly became something quieter, was the sense that she had never quite had time to sit with the grief the way it perhaps deserved. It came back in the corners of seasons, she explained, in the particular quality of winter cold, in the smell of certain evenings, in the way December light falls on a city street in a way that is somehow both beautiful and very lonely, and manages to be both at once without apology. Pause. Ichi listened to all of this without offering much in return, only adjusting his posture occasionally, shifting his weight slightly, so that she could feel he was still present, still holding the thread of what she was giving him. She paused at one point and apologized gently, saying she did not usually talk this much about herself, did not usually have someone to talk this much about herself with, and he told her simply that he was glad to listen, and that she should say as much or as little as she needed. She smiled at that, a small and somewhat tired smile, and then she told him something that stayed with him for a long time after that evening ended and he had walked home through the cold. She told him that her husband had been the sort of person who listened without steering, who had never seemed impatient for a conversation to arrive at something about himself, who had simply been present with whatever she brought to him, and that this quality had been one of the things she had loved most and also missed most. Pause. And she said that she had found herself, without quite planning to, thinking of that quality when she sat with Ichi in the evenings, not confusing one man for another, but recognizing something she had not encountered for a long time and finding it, unexpectedly, quietly present again. It was why, she admitted softly, December had felt its weight differently this year, because for the first time in a long while she had someone to sit inside it with, and that presence had brought the loss both a little closer and somehow, strangely, a little gentler. She looked slightly embarrassed by the admission, the way someone does when they have said something true and then heard how true it sounded, and she turned to look across the room at something that was not quite there. Breath. He let the silence hold without filling it, because it seemed to him the right thing to do, to let it rest in its own weight for a moment before anything else was said. Then he told her he was glad to be there, and he meant it with a fullness he had not quite felt before about such a simple and ordinary statement. She wiped her eyes once, very briefly, more a reflex than any kind of display, and then she said she was sorry for making the evening heavy, and he told her that some evenings needed their weight in order to be worth what they were. She laughed softly at that, a real laugh, slightly surprised out of her, and said that he sounded like an old man when he said such things, and he said he had been told that before, and she laughed again, a little more freely. She poured them both a little more from the ceramic bottle, and by the time she set it down the shadow on her face had lifted somewhat, not entirely, because such shadows do not lift entirely in a single evening, but enough that the room felt able to breathe again. Pause. They talked for another hour or more after that, about lighter things, about a temple festival she remembered attending years ago with a friend who had since moved to Osaka, about a dish she was planning to try the following week, about the particular stillness of winter in that neighborhood and how she had come to prefer it over the noise of summer. When he finally rose to leave and pulled on his coat, she walked him to the entrance the way she always did, and told him he should come again whenever he liked. But something in the way she said it was slightly different from before, a warmth more openly acknowledged, more deliberately extended, and he carried that small difference home with him through the cold December streets without quite knowing yet what to do with it. He walked with his hands in his pockets and his breath fogging faintly in the night air, past the closed shutters of the small shops and the orange-lit windows of the apartments above them, the city going about its quiet winter business all around him. Long pause. He thought about what she had told him, about the 10 years she had carried more or less alone, about the husband who had listened the way she described, about the look on her face when she spoke of those first months of raising Tomoko without the person she had expected to do it alongside. And somewhere in the quiet of that walk, moving through the particular loneliness of a city night in winter, he understood something about his own feelings that he had been approaching from the outside for some time without quite arriving at the center of it. He had come to care about her, not as a friend's mother, not as the kind and generous woman who fed him well and received his silences without complaint, but as a person whose life he found himself wanting to be near, whose winters he found himself wanting to be less cold. Pause. He came back the following week, and she had made a pot of root vegetable soup, thick and fragrant, the kind that belongs to cold weather in a way that nothing else quite does, and the evening settled around them with the gentle authority of evenings that have learned what they are. And the week after that, and the one after, and somewhere in those weeks his feeling for her grew not louder but steadier, the way certain certainties do not arrive with any particular noise but simply become present one day, already settled, already durable, already entirely themselves. He did not speak of it yet, understanding that the right moment for such things is not always the first moment they are felt, that some feelings need to fully become themselves before they can be offered to another person with any real honesty. But he came, and she welcomed him, and the evenings continued in their quiet procession, the ceramic cups and the low lamp and the paper screen and the sound of the winter city outside reduced to something distant and undemanding, like weather that has decided to be gentle. Breath. There is a kind of belonging that makes itself known slowly, that does not require a single moment of recognition but instead accumulates, evening by quiet evening, until one day it is simply there, warm and certain and already entirely at home in you. This was that kind, and he sat inside it without yet naming it aloud, and the long winter held them both in its careful dark, and the little room was lit and warm, and whatever came next could wait, as it always does, for its own right time to arrive. And that, perhaps, is where we will rest for tonight, in the warmth of that small room, in the sound of a ceramic bottle set gently back down on the low table, in the patient and unhurried waiting of a December that has not yet decided what it will become. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it dissolve the way a half-remembered dream dissolves when morning light touches the curtain, gently, without resistance, without grief. There is nothing to hold on to now. Only the quiet, which is always here, patient and wide, waiting for you beneath every story we tell. If you like, take a slow breath now in through the nose, soft and unhurried, and let it go again, carrying with it whatever still lingers. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a tender thing held carefully in the hands of time. There is no rush to arrive. Let the space between carry you there, easy as drifting. Somewhere in the middle of the city, in an ordinary apartment on an ordinary floor, a winter evening was settling over everything without ceremony, slowly and without announcement, the way winter evenings tend to do. The windows had been holding the dark since late afternoon, and the light inside the small room was warm and yellow, and on the low table dinner was set out with the quiet care she brought to all the small routines of their shared life. Steam rose from the bowls of miso soup in soft, unhurried columns, and the room smelled of dashi and rice, and she moved between the kitchen and the table with a familiarity she had not quite noticed herself accumulating. She had observed, somewhere between ladling the soup and wiping down the counter, that something about him was not quite as it usually was that evening. She said nothing at first, moving with the kind of quiet that a person learns when they have lived long enough alongside someone to sense the weight of a silence before anyone speaks. Pause. She set out the chopsticks and smoothed the cloth napkin beside each bowl, and she watched, from the corner of her eye, the way he sat at the table and looked toward his dinner without quite seeing it. He had the expression of a person who has been carrying something all day, some small but stubborn weight, and has not yet decided whether the evening is the right place to set it down. When she asked him, gently, whether something had happened, he offered the usual assurance that nothing was wrong, in the reflexive way that people say such things before they have thought carefully about whether it is true. She accepted it with a small nod, as she had learned over the months to accept those first quiet denials, knowing they were not dishonesty so much as a kind of holding pattern, a way of getting through the first minutes of an evening before deciding what it was possible to say aloud. She had come to know the texture of his difficult evenings not from anything he told her directly, but from the small observable patterns that 6 months of shared meals and shared mornings tends to quietly accumulate. When something at work troubled him, he would often take himself out into the cold night air after dinner, walking through the neighborhood at a steady, deliberate pace, as though the city's quiet held some property of patience that the interior of rooms could not offer, and he would return home a little lighter than he had left. Pause. And so when he mentioned, a little later, that he thought he might step outside for a while, the words were familiar in their phrasing, if not in their precise occasion. She asked, very softly, whether she might come along. He was still for a moment, and she had time to wonder whether he would fold whatever he was carrying back into himself and say he was fine, that he would be back soon. But he said yes, quietly, and something in the plainness of it told her the answer had come without much deliberating. They found their coats from the hook near the door and wound their scarves around their necks, and the door clicked shut behind them, and the stairwell was briefly cold, and then the street was colder still. Long pause. The neighborhood at that hour held the particular quiet that cities make in the late evening, not absent of sound but softened. The day's noise receded to a low ambient hum at the edges of things, a distant train, the crossing signal 2 blocks over ticking through its patient count. The air was properly cold, the kind that settles behind the ears and finds the hollow beneath a scarf, and their breath came out in small pale clouds that rose and dispersed in the lamplight above them as they walked. She did not press him, and he was grateful for the restraint, and they moved through the quiet in the kind of companionable silence that 2 people can walk in when they have shared a kitchen and a corridor and the small sounds of an ordinary dwelling for long enough to know its weight. Breath. He began to talk eventually, the way people begin when the cold and the rhythm of walking and the generous patience of the night have done their slow work. He told her about his junior colleague at the office, a young man still learning the work, who brought to it a careful and willing attention, and who had made a small mistake on a report that week, a modest lapse in a check that should have caught it. He told her how he had come across the error during his review and had corrected it himself without hesitation, making a quiet note in the file, setting it back where it belonged, without ever mentioning to the young man what he had found or what he had fixed. He told her how his senior colleague had come to him afterward, in the measured way of someone who addresses such things calmly because he has seen them many times and knows that patience is more useful than urgency. His senior had asked him, without reproach, why he had not let the young man address his own mistake, and the question had held itself in the air between them for a moment longer than he had expected. Pause. His senior had observed that the value of an error lies not only in having it corrected, but in the conversation that surrounds it, in asking together where the thinking went sideways and what might be done differently, because that is where the understanding lives, not in the fixed file but in the careful approach to the fixing. The same senior man had also noticed how he had replied when the young man asked whether there were other tasks to take on, and how he had said there was nothing available, when the real difficulty was simply that he had never found it easy to explain a task to someone else, to hand something over and trust that the handing over itself might be enough. He laid all of this out in a slow, deliberate way as they walked, and she listened without interrupting, her hands in her jacket pockets, her eyes on the pavement ahead. Pause. He told her it had always seemed easier to do a thing himself than to explain it to another person, faster and simpler and less likely to produce the particular discomfort of waiting to see whether someone else would manage it as he would have done. She was quiet for a moment after he finished, and they passed a row of bicycles chained to a railing outside a shuttered shop, the baskets empty, the handlebars beaded with cold. Then she told him, gently, that she thought she understood something in what he was describing, and that it brought to mind something she had been meaning to mention for a while, though she had not known quite how to begin. She told him about the mornings she had overslept, early in her time at the cafe, when the unfamiliar demands of a new schedule had pulled her into a sleep too deep to surface from on her own, and she had woken to find the breakfast things already put away and the kitchen quietly tidy. Breath. She told him she had been genuinely grateful each time, because she understood that he had done it to spare her, and she felt the kindness in it, and she wanted him to know that she had felt it. But there had been another feeling underneath the gratitude, she told him, a small and quiet one she had not quite known how to name, a sense of being accommodated rather than relied upon, of being taken care of in a way that kept her at a slight remove from the caring itself. Pause. She told him she was not saying it to suggest he had done something wrong, because he had not, but only so that he might understand that being needed and being cared for are not always the same thing, and that people who are still finding their footing sometimes need the first as much as the second. She told him she thought the young man at the office might have felt something not entirely unlike this, finding his error already resolved and returned to him finished, the correction made but the conversation around it never happening. He walked in silence for a moment, and then told her she was probably right. And then, after another stretch of quiet, as they came around the corner where the convenience store threw its warm amber light across the damp pavement in a long soft rectangle, he told her something he had not entirely planned to say. He told her that he had never been very good at other people. He said it plainly, without drama or self-pity, the way people say the most honest things when the late hour and the cold and the rhythm of walking have done away with the careful protections that daylight tends to keep in place. Pause. He described, slowly, how he had moved through school with very few friendships, how the distance between himself and the people around him had always seemed to open before he had found a way to close it, as though the gap were structural somehow, built into the way he occupied a space. He told her he had come to think of this as simply the shape of himself, not a wound exactly and not quite a failing, but a quality, the way a building can be made without many windows and still be a building. He told her that when his junior colleague kept a careful and courteous distance, he recognized it without surprise, because people had always kept that kind of distance, and he had long since stopped expecting otherwise. He admitted, in a quieter voice, that he had never found it easy to ask for things, or to acknowledge when something was hard, or to allow another person to carry even the smallest share of what he was already carrying. Pause. And then he told her something that surprised him even in the telling, that on the night they had met, on that cold street, some part of him had wondered whether choosing to speak to a stranger might be a kind of test he was setting for himself, a small and tentative experiment in being different, in interrupting his ordinary reflex towards silence and passing by. He told her his reasons had not been entirely generous, that there was something in them that was about himself as much as it was about her, and he said this quietly, preparing himself for her to hear it and perhaps to feel something cooler than she had been feeling a moment before. She had stopped walking. Pause. He noticed after a few steps and turned, and her face in the amber light of the street was very still, and then it was not still at all, and she was crying, quietly, in the way people cry when something has arrived before they had time to prepare for it. He said her name and asked, softly, what was wrong, and she shook her head slightly, not to dismiss him but to collect herself, and when she spoke her voice was unsteady but very clear. She told him she did not agree with how he was describing himself. Breath. She told him she had lived alongside him for 6 months, and that she had paid close attention, and that the person she had observed over that time was not the person he was currently describing. She told him he was kind, genuinely and quietly kind, in the way that is easy to miss if a person is looking only for the kind that announces itself, because his kindness expressed itself in restraint, in choosing not to disturb, in small unremarked acts of consideration offered to the people around him without any expectation that anyone would notice or name them. She told him the distance he described was not, in her experience of him, a coldness, but something closer to a shyness between the feeling and the gesture, a hesitation in the space between what he sensed and what he allowed to be seen. Pause. She told him, and her voice had steadied now, that she would not accept the version of himself he was offering, because it did not match the evidence of 6 months, and she felt confident enough in those months to say so directly. He stood in the cold street and listened to all of this and found, for once, that he had no easy response waiting for him. She wiped her face with the back of her hand in a composed, matter-of-fact way, and told him she had something she wanted to suggest. She said it was a small thing, and she wanted him to know that she knew it was small, because she did not believe in asking for large changes from a person before they had practiced the small ones, having come to that belief from a life that had asked her to begin again more than once with very little. Pause. She told him she wanted to help, not as a transaction or a repayment, but because she had come to care about the shape of his life and thought she might be in a position, in a modest way, to do something useful for it. What she proposed was simple: to practice, in the ordinary moments of their shared days, the small habit of reaching toward someone rather than away, starting at home, asking to be woken when it would help, mentioning before the evening walk that something had been difficult, letting another person in a little closer before the distance became something she had quietly decided for both of them. She told him she was not asking for a transformation, that she had no interest in a different person, only in this one being a little less alone in the carrying of whatever he was carrying. He looked at her in the lamplight, this young woman who had arrived at his door with nothing but a worn coat and a tiredness too old for her years, and who had turned out to hold something steadier and warmer and more perceptive than the cold street would have had any right to promise. Pause. He told her he would try. He said it plainly, without ceremony, because the moment did not seem to need it, and she accepted it without ceremony in return, and they turned together and began the walk back toward the apartment. The street was the same as it had been half an hour before, the same lamp at the corner, the same bicycles by the shuttered shop, the same low hum of the city carrying itself forward through the night. But the distance between them as they walked had narrowed in the way that a frank conversation sometimes narrows a distance that two people have been carefully, and separately, maintaining. Breath. Back in the apartment, the miso soup had gone cool, and he reheated it on the stove while she set the table again, and they sat down and finished their dinner together in a quiet that was different from the earlier quiet, warmer in a way that would have been difficult to name precisely, but that neither of them could have missed. He thanked her again, at the end of the meal, plainly. She told him there was no need for thanks. He told her, quietly, that there was, and she let that sit, and the small lamp on the shelf cast its warm circle over the table and the empty bowls, and the evening grew quieter still as the hour grew later. Pause. Outside, the city continued as cities continue in the late hours, its lights holding steady and its sounds softened to a murmur somewhere at the edges of things, and inside the small apartment two people who had found each other entirely by accident were arriving, in the slow and unhurried way of ordinary things, at something a little clearer than they had understood before. The lamp was turned off eventually, and the darkness settled, and the evening became night the way evenings always do, without drama or announcement, only the gradual withdrawal of light and the quiet that followed. And perhaps that is where this chapter of the story rests tonight, in the warm dark of a small room after a winter walk, in the slight closing of a distance between two people who had each, in their own way, let the other in a little further than before. Pause. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way a dream fades when morning is still hours away, softly, without ceremony, like mist lifting from still water. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one. Let your breath slow, in and out, and feel the weight of your body sinking a little deeper into where you rest. You are safe. The night is quiet, and the night is long. When you are ready, and only when you are ready, our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a gentle place, carried quietly across many years, waiting now to be told. Somewhere along the slow weeks of that shared apartment, without either of them quite deciding it, a certain rhythm had settled in, like the way evening light finds its way through frosted glass without being invited. She would still make demands, still arrange the rooms according to her preferences, still regard his questions with the mild indifference of someone accustomed to the world accommodating itself around her. He had learned, slowly and with some effort, to move around her habits the way one learns to navigate a familiar room in the dark, without collision, without resentment, simply by memory. She cooked in the evenings, and he had come to understand that this was not nothing. She moved through the kitchen with a sureness that surprised him, given how little she understood of ordinary life in other respects. She hummed sometimes, low and almost inaudible, while moving a wooden spoon through whatever was simmering on the stove, and somewhere along the way he had quietly stopped pretending that he did not notice. What he could not quite set aside, though, was the phone. It was there at breakfast, lit and glowing beside her tea, and it was there at dinner, held just below the edge of the table, her fingers working with a quiet urgency that seemed out of place in an otherwise unhurried evening. He had tried, once, to ask about it gently, without accusation, and she had looked through him the way one looks through a window at whether one has already decided to ignore. Her hand had paused for just a moment over the screen, then continued, and the conversation, such as it had been, was over before it had fully begun. He had let it go, telling himself it was none of his concern, that she was entitled to her privacy, that whatever she was managing on that small glowing rectangle was hers alone to manage. But her father, the president, had asked him to pay attention, and so paying attention was something he did, more carefully than he would have otherwise, without quite wanting to. He had the sense, watching her across the table in those quiet evenings, that she was carrying something she had not chosen to carry and yet had found herself carrying anyway. The expression that crossed her face when she read those messages was not the expression of someone in casual conversation with a friend, it was the expression of someone thinking very carefully about each word before sending it. There was a kind of concentration to it, and sometimes, when she did not know he was watching, something else would flicker across her features, something closer to worry, or to the particular exhaustion that comes from managing a difficult thing entirely alone. He noticed, and said nothing, and the days continued. On the evening that everything became clear, he left work a little earlier than usual, stopping on his way home at the small cake shop near the station. It was a minor thing, he had bought one there a few weeks before on impulse, and she had eaten her slice without comment, and then very quietly, when she believed he was not watching, a second slice, and then a third. He had not mentioned it, and neither had she, but the next time he passed the shop he found himself stopping without quite deciding to. The evening was mild and overcast, the kind of Tokyo evening where the city sounds come through softened, muffled by the particular quality of the air just before rain. He took the elevator to the third floor with the small white box balanced carefully in one hand, thinking about nothing important, whether she would acknowledge the cake, whether dinner was already made, whether she had hummed while she cooked that afternoon. And then the elevator doors opened, and he stepped into the corridor, and stopped. There was a man outside his door, a man he had never seen before, and the man was crouched low, his hands working at the lock with something small and metallic that caught the corridor light. For a moment he simply stood there, the cake box held still in both hands, his mind searching as minds will for some innocent explanation, some ordinary reason why a stranger might be kneeling at his door with a tool in his hand at this hour. There was no innocent explanation, and after a moment, a long, slow moment, he stepped back very quietly toward the emergency stairwell, careful not to make a sound. He went down to the ground floor and called the police, speaking in a low and steady voice, giving the address and the floor number and describing what he had seen, and the officer on the other end told him that someone would come. A patrol car had been nearby, as it happened, and the officers arrived within minutes, and he led them quietly back up the stairs, his heart slower now than it might have been, steadied by a kind of focused calm he did not entirely recognize in himself. When they reached the third floor, the man at the door had managed to work the lock open and was in the act of crossing the threshold. One of the officers spoke out steadily, and the man turned, and for a single suspended moment the hallway held a strange stillness, and then it broke, and it was done in a matter of moments. The man was taken down with a practiced efficiency, and then there were handcuffs, and the ordinary sounds of the building returned around them, a television somewhere down the hall, the quiet hum of the elevator descending. He did not wait. He went straight through the apartment, calling her name softly as he moved, needing to know she was there. She was in the far room, her room, the one she had claimed as her own on the first day, and she was on the floor beside the bed, her knees drawn up, her arms folded tightly around herself, trembling in a way that was not quite controlled. He had seen her in many moods across those weeks, dismissive, imperious, occasionally almost playful in a way she seemed not to intend, but he had never seen her like this, and the sight of it did something to him that he could not immediately name. He knelt beside her and asked, as gently as he could, whether she was all right, and she did not answer, only looked at him with eyes that were bright and full and trying very hard not to overflow. An officer came briefly to the doorway. The man had been carrying a knife, he mentioned, in the careful tone of someone delivering difficult information quietly, and the meaning of that settled into the room like something heavy and slow. They would meet him at the station the following day to give a full statement. Tonight, the officer said, everyone could rest. When the officers had gone and the apartment was quiet again, she was sitting on the floor of her room with her back against the foot of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, very still and very small. He sat down a short distance away, leaving her the space she might need, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the apartment held around them the particular quiet that follows something that has been, and is now over. Then, slowly, in the way of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally decided it is safe to set it down, she began to talk. The messages, she told him, had been going on for months, long before she had come to live in his apartment, long before any of this arrangement had begun. There was a man, she recalled, who had concluded that her father's position entitled him to something, and who had decided that she was the means by which he would collect it. He had written to her at all hours, sometimes demanding, sometimes in language that sounded almost reasonable, and underneath the reasonable language, every time, the same unmistakable shape of a threat. He had told her to take money from her father, and when she declined, he had told her what he would do if she continued to decline, and the things he had described were not gentle. She had not given him anything, not once, not a single thing, and her voice as she said this was very quiet and steady, even as the trembling that had not quite left her hands betrayed what holding that line had cost her. She would not have done it, she confided, because the thought of something happening to her father on her account was something she could not allow herself to contemplate, and so she had answered the messages instead, carefully, in the language of someone trying to buy time. All those evenings with the phone held just below the table's edge, all those mornings with it glowing beside her tea, she had been, in her particular way, keeping something at bay. He listened without moving, and when she had finished, the room was very quiet around them, the kind of quiet that follows a truth that has needed to be spoken for a long time and has finally been allowed out into the air. He found himself thinking about those evenings across the dinner table, about the expression on her face that he had wondered about and had not understood, the concentration, the careful control, the flicker of something exhausted beneath the surface, and understood it now, all of it, at once. She had managed all of this entirely alone, she observed, because there had been no one to tell, and then she had come to live in a stranger's apartment and there had still been no one to tell. For weeks she had carried it here, in a place she had not chosen, with a person she did not know, going through the ordinary motions of cooking and eating and moving through shared days, and never letting on. The thought of that, the sheer, quiet endurance of it, moved him in a way he had not been expecting to be moved. Without quite deciding to, he reached out and put his arms around her, carefully, the way one holds something that has been under great strain and might benefit from being held very gently. She went still for a moment, and then the stillness broke open, and she cried in the way that people cry when they have been not crying for a very long time, not dramatically, but steadily, as if something long held in was simply, finally, letting itself go. He murmured a few things, quiet and unremarkable, that she had done well, that he was sorry he had not understood sooner, that the man was gone and would not come back, and the words themselves were ordinary, but the tone in which he offered them was not. He felt, somewhere in the space between one moment and the next, that something had shifted between them, quietly, without announcement, the way a season shifts, all at once and with very little fanfare. He had spent weeks finding her difficult, and she had been difficult, and none of that was inaccurate, and yet here, in this moment, with her crying quietly against his shoulder, he understood that difficult people carry things too, and that sometimes the difficulty is precisely the carrying. After a while the crying slowed and then stopped, and she pulled back and looked away, and he looked away too, giving her the small privacy of recovering herself without an audience. The cake was still in its box on the kitchen counter, forgotten in the rush of the evening, and later, much later, after tea had been made and the worst of it had settled into something more bearable, he remembered it and brought it to the table. She looked at the box for a moment, and then at him, and something in her expression shifted into the faintest trace of something he recognized, the expression she wore when she had taken the second slice, the third slice, the quiet pleasure she allowed herself in small things when she believed no one was paying attention. She did not offer thanks in so many words, that had never quite been her way, but she took a fork and cut into the cake and ate slowly, and the rain had started outside, and the kitchen light was warm and yellow above them. He sat across from her and watched the rain move down the window glass and did not try to fill the quiet, because the quiet felt like exactly the right shape for what the evening had been. Somewhere in that stillness, in the small sounds of a fork against a plate and rain against glass, he allowed himself to understand something he had been carefully not understanding for several weeks now. He had been worried about her, specifically, particularly, in the way one worries about someone who has become specific to them, not the abstract concern of someone doing a job, but the slightly inconvenient worry of someone who has begun, without permission, to care. He could not have said exactly when it had happened, whether it was the first time she hummed while she cooked, or the evening she had made his favorite dish without being asked or acknowledged, or simply the slow accumulation of ordinary days lived in close proximity to another person. But it had happened, and sitting across from her in the warm kitchen with the rain falling steadily outside, he found he did not particularly want to argue himself out of it. She finished the last of the cake and set her fork down, and for a moment she looked at the table, and then she looked up at him, and her expression held something he had not seen in it before, something softer, a little uncertain, as though she too were recognizing something and was not entirely sure what to make of it. The evening had begun as an ordinary one, with a small white cake box and the ordinary intention of coming home a little early, and had become something else entirely, something that would take a little time to fully understand. Outside, the rain continued, steady and unhurried, settling in for the long night, asking nothing of anyone. She would still be herself, in the days that followed, still particular, still demanding in her small ways, still arranging the world according to her own private logic, and he found, thinking about it quietly, that he would not have changed this even if he could. The thing between them was still nameless, still unspoken, still needing a little more time before it could become anything that might be said aloud without frightening it away. But it was there, in the kitchen, in the rain, in the small warmth of a shared evening that had been a very difficult one and had ended, nonetheless, with cake and quiet and the sound of water on glass. And that, perhaps, is where this part of the story rests for tonight, in the quiet after the fear has passed, in the unexpected tenderness of an ordinary kitchen, in two people sitting across from each other in the soft noise of the rain and beginning, very slowly, to see. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its shadows grow quiet and still, the way a candle flame settles after the last breath of wind has passed through a room. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one, let your shoulders soften a little more into the pillow, let a slow breath come and go on its own. The night is patient, and so are we. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a gentle place held gently in the mind, soft at the edges the way old photographs grow soft, not with sadness, but with the particular tenderness that only time can give to things we cherished. Rest easy. We are in no rush at all. Somewhere in a drawer, or perhaps tucked behind a stack of letters that have not been opened in years, there is a notebook, its cover softened with time, its pages holding two kinds of handwriting, one careful and the other looping, and both of them young. The story of how it came to exist begins on a mild spring morning, in the second year of high school, when a new class had just been assembled and the desks rearranged into unfamiliar rows, and no one yet knew quite where to settle their attention. She was seated one row ahead and slightly to the left, and her hair was pulled back with a small clip, a barrette, the kind with a narrow ribbon woven through the clasp, and without particularly meaning to, he said aloud that it was lovely. She turned around, slowly, and in the moment their eyes met across the short space of classroom air, her face went warm and red all at once, from the edge of her jaw to the rims of her ears, and her eyes were very still and very large. He sat with that image for a moment, the stillness of her expression, the way the color had moved across her face, and then the morning continued, the teacher arrived, the lesson began, and life went on in its ordinary way. He had, at that point in the spring, his attention aimed elsewhere, toward a girl in his after-school club, someone he had known through a whole winter of rehearsals and late meetings, someone he had thought about with the deliberate patience of a person who intends eventually to say something. And so the barrette, and the blush, and the moment of unexpected eye contact were filed away under the heading of things that simply happened, the way many small and significant things are filed during the crowded, busy years of school. The new class settled into its familiar rhythms, the same faces at the same desks each morning, the particular sound of the room before the teacher arrived, the late afternoon light that came through the wide windows and lay in long pale rectangles across the wooden floor. There is a task that most Japanese school classes must perform early in each year, a small piece of civic organization in which the students choose representatives to manage the minor administrative life of the classroom, and when this moment arrived, the girls had already quietly arranged things among themselves. She was selected first, which made obvious sense. She had experience from her club activities, She carried the organized manner of someone who had grown up helping in a family shop, and the teacher accepted the nomination without hesitation, writing her name on the board in a single stroke. For the boys, no one volunteered, and into the small silence that followed, her friends offered his name with a cheerful and entirely unself-conscious confidence that left the room briefly, collectively unsure of how to respond. Their reasoning, stated plainly for anyone who could hear, was that he clearly had feelings for her, and so would naturally work hard on her behalf, and the logic of this was apparently so self-evident to them that they simply announced it and waited for the room to agree. The teacher blinked, and several students turned in their seats, and he felt the very particular quality of a room in which every person is waiting to see what he will do with the next few seconds of his life. She had turned to look at him from across the desks, and her hands were pressed together in front of her in a gesture that might have been apology, might have been something closer to a question, and he read everything in the room as quickly as he could and said yes, he supposed he would do his best. From that moment, without any private conversation between them, without any formal agreement or exchange of notes, the classroom had decided they were a couple, and the teasing that might otherwise have accompanied such a thing was kept, by some unspoken agreement, gentle and at a comfortable distance. The girl from his club heard about it by the end of the day, and he found, when he considered this, that the chapter he had been quietly composing in his mind for several months had arrived at a natural ending, the way some chapters do before you expect them to. He and she, this new she, the one with the barrette, began spending time together in the easy, slightly uncertain way of two people who have been placed in each other's orbit by outside forces and are quietly determining whether they actually belong there. They walked to the station sometimes, and talked about the ordinary things that fill such walks, their clubs, their teachers, the food in the school canteen, the small complaints and observations that accumulate during any given week, and these conversations were unremarkable, and also, somehow, not. It was she who produced the notebook, appearing one afternoon at his desk with a small spiral-bound book and the calm, matter-of-fact manner of someone who has already decided something and is simply informing you of the arrangement. The idea was simple. He would write something, anything, whatever came to mind, and hand it back, and she would reply, and this would continue, a small conversation conducted on paper, passed between classes, carried in a bag, slipped quietly from hand to hand in the corridors between lessons. He was, by his own later admission, better at practical things than at the softer ones, better at doing than at describing, better at sitting beside someone than at finding words for what that sitting meant to him. His early entries in the notebook were thorough accounts of his days and not much else. The weather that morning, the content of lessons, observations about club activities, the occasional brief opinion about something that had been served at lunch. She filled the pages beside his in her looping hand, writing about her own days with more ease and color, and at some point she wrote that she could not quite see where things stood between them, that he was warm in person but quiet on the page, and she wondered, gently, what he actually felt. He read this in the corridor one afternoon, standing near the window where light came through at a low winter angle, and he stood there for a moment with the notebook open, and then he turned to the next blank page and wrote, "You are lovely, and I think about you quite a lot." And then, because it felt incomplete, he added on the line below, "Lovely and kind, and I mean both of these things exactly as I have written them, not as habit, not as something said to fill the space." He had tucked these sentences into the end of a longer entry, as if hoping they might be found gradually rather than all at once, but she found them immediately, reading with the attention of someone who had been waiting for something and recognized it when it arrived. From that point forward, each entry she wrote ended with a small question about whether he still felt the same, not anxious, exactly, but curious in the way she had always been curious about where she stood with people who mattered to her. He answered always with a version of the same quiet affirmation, and this became over time a kind of ritual between them, a ceremony that closed each exchange, warm and slightly repetitive and entirely belonging to the two of them alone. The school year moved through its seasons in the way school years always do, slowly through the long middle weeks, and then faster as autumn arrived, the ginkgo trees along the road to the station turning yellow all at once as if they had made some private agreement. Winter came, and with winter came Valentine's Day in February, which in Japan falls to the girls, the custom being that they give chocolate to the boys in their lives, both as social gesture and, sometimes, as something much more deliberate than that. She spent an evening in the kitchen making small chocolate-dipped cookies, shaping them carefully by hand, setting them on a tray to cool, then packing them into paper bags with the methodical attention she brought to anything that mattered to her. The bags for her friends received 4 cookies each, sealed with a small ribbon, and she counted these out with care, and then she came to the last bag, the one she had set aside from the very beginning, before she had even started mixing the batter. Into his bag she placed 5 cookies, one more, just one, a single degree of difference that she assumed would be understood immediately by anyone who was paying attention, which she was quite certain he was. She had also chosen a different colored ribbon for his bag, which seemed to her an equally clear signal, and she had packed his bag last and most carefully, selecting the most evenly made cookies, the ones with the smoothest chocolate and the most consistent shape, and she was satisfied with them. She found him after school, near the entrance, and she held the bag out to him and said here, almost before he had finished turning around, and then she walked away down the stone path, which meant she did not see his face as he looked down at what she had handed him. He stood holding the small paper bag and thought, as he watched her retreating figure, her footsteps quiet on the path between the shoe lockers and the gate, that perhaps one cookie had been left over from an uneven batch, a simple remainder, and that to read too much into a single extra cookie would be hasty and possibly embarrassing. He noticed the ribbon was a different color but found himself uncertain whether this meant anything specific, and the cookies inside were all the same shape, which seemed to suggest nothing remarkable had been intended, and so he put the bag carefully in his satchel and went home and thought about it. He thought about it for 10 days, which is, by any reasonable accounting, a long time to think about a cookie, but he was cautious by nature, and the specific fear of being wrong about something this important was enough to hold him very still. She was not still. She watched the classroom entrance each morning, exchanged glances with her friends in the particular way of someone waiting for news, and grew gradually more certain that something had either gone wrong or that the difference between 4 cookies and 5 was less legible to him than she had imagined it would be. Her friends, who had been observing all of this with increasing impatience, eventually told him, in their direct and patient way, that enough time had passed and he should probably say something before the whole situation grew past the point of easy recovery. He found her after school, in the corridor near the club rooms where the floor smelled faintly of the cleaning solution used at the end of each day, and he told her, in words he had been quietly arranging and rearranging for the better part of 2 weeks, that he had feelings for her and would like, if she was willing, to spend more time with her. She looked at him with an expression he found difficult to read at first, not surprised, exactly, but arriving from some distance, the way someone looks when news comes later than they expected, and she replied, gently, that she had been wondering when he would get around to it. He mentioned the cookies, and his theory about an uneven batch, and she considered him for a long moment with an expression that moved through disbelief and arrived, eventually, at something that was simply warm and fond. No, she told him softly, it had not been left over. There was a small pause, and then the corridor was simply a corridor again, and they were simply 2 people standing in it, and he found himself thinking that the late afternoon felt slightly different than it had a moment before, though he could not have explained in words how or why. The exchange notebook continued after that, though the entries shifted in character over the weeks that followed, less careful, less anxious, more like the small notes that people leave for each other when the essential things have already been said and they are now simply keeping company on the page. University took them to different campuses a few years later, and different commutes, and different daily circles of acquaintance, but they found ways to stay close, the way people do when they have arrived, without discussing it aloud, at a shared understanding about where things are going. There was a difficult stretch he recalled only in outline, a week of necessary conversations, he would say, the details kept private, when an old connection of his turned up at the same university as his girlfriend, and certain old uncertainties surfaced briefly in the air between them before settling quietly back down where they belonged. Time moved on, as it does, and they graduated, and found their separate footholds in working life, and after 3 years of adult independence they were married, in a ceremony that those who attended would describe, later, as having the atmosphere of something that had always been on its way and had simply, at last, arrived. Their domestic life arranged itself around their separate temperaments with the ease of two people who have already learned the shape of each other. She remained the decisive one, the maker of telephone calls, the rememberer of dates, the person with quietly authoritative opinions about where the furniture should go. He remained the one who noticed the quieter things, the particular way she arranged objects on the kitchen shelf at the end of an evening, the small sound she made when she was concentrating on something difficult, the angle at which she turned her head when something amused her without quite breaking into a full smile. Years accumulated in the way years do in a shared life, through moves to new apartments with different views and different light, through changes in work and season, through the small negotiations and adjustments that constitute the actual daily texture of living alongside another person, year after year. A daughter was born, and grew up in the observant way of children whose parents have known each other for a very long time, absorbing the grammar of their life together without being taught it, asking questions with the direct confidence of someone who assumes honesty is simply the default mode of conversation. One evening in the daughter's early teens, her father came home to find her at the low table in the living room with a small notebook open in front of her, reading it with the careful attention of someone who has found something unexpected and is deciding how she feels about it. The mother appeared in the doorway within moments. She had always had a particular gift for appearing in doorways at important moments, and she recognized the notebook from across the room, and crossed the space between them quickly, and retrieved it, holding it against her chest with an expression that was warm and slightly helpless all at once. At dinner that evening, the daughter looked across the table at her father and observed, with the precise and affectionate smile of someone who has read carefully, that he had apparently been telling her mother she was lovely since they were both 16 years old. He noted that some of what was written in the notebook had been, in a manner of speaking, requested of him, and the daughter received this explanation with the polite interest of someone who does not believe a word of it but finds the not believing entirely pleasant. The mother said nothing, but she was smiling too, and the notebook remained in her lap beneath the table rather than being returned to its shelf, which was not quite the same as putting it away. Later that evening, after the daughter had gone upstairs and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, he noticed the notebook left on the kitchen counter, not prominently, not as a statement, simply there, the way you leave something you want to keep within reach for a little while longer. The 15th anniversary arrived in due course, and he brought home a small cake from the shop near the station and a bundle of flowers wrapped in brown paper, and he found her in the kitchen, and he said the phrase, the one from the notebook, the one that had become their closing ceremony across so many pages and so many years, but said it carefully this time, with the weight of someone who has chosen the moment and knows that it is the right one. She wept, which surprised him, because she had not wept at other anniversaries, not even the larger ones with more elaborate preparations, and he held her for a while in the kitchen while the flowers in their paper sat on the counter and the cake waited on the table with patient irrelevance. When she had composed herself, she told him what she had told him before and what apparently needed saying again from time to time, that the everyday version of the phrase had a different quality than the deliberate one, the one chosen for a particular evening, the one that arrived with evidence of having been thought about. He stored this carefully in the long inventory he kept of how she moved through the world, what she needed without always naming it, what made the ordinary thing feel, in the right moment, entirely otherwise, and he kept it there, where he could find it again. The daughter grew, and eventually came to know the whole story, the notebooks, the cookies, the 10 days of deliberation, the corridor outside the club rooms where he had finally said what needed saying, and she seems to have taken from it some understanding of the way love tends to move. Careful at first, and then certain, and then slow and warm and steady for a very long time afterward. There is something in the gap between 4 cookies and 5 that is easy to dismiss, easy to attribute to an uneven batch or a miscounted row of cooling dough, and yet she had not miscounted, and the 5 had been selected last and most carefully, and the ribbon had been chosen with deliberate, quiet care. And there is something in the 10 days of stillness too, in the patience of someone who does not want to be wrong about what matters most, that is its own form of seriousness, its own quiet proof that the thing was being taken seriously. Somewhere in the house there is still a notebook, soft at the spine now, its cover worn pale at the corners, and it is possible that on certain evenings it comes out from wherever it lives, placed on a counter, left where it might be found, held for a moment before being returned to its drawer. The barrette is long gone, most likely lost in one of the moves that accumulate over a shared life, or simply set down one day and not picked up again, but she still turns her head at the same angle when something catches her attention quietly, the same angle he first noticed on the opening morning of the new school year, before he knew anything about her at all. And he still finds himself writing things down, apparently still reaching for the page when the voice is not quite ready, still choosing the deliberate sentence over the accidental one, still arriving at the end of an entry with the same phrase he used to write in a small school notebook a long time ago, when the words were new and the pages were blank and he was not yet sure she would want to read them. The cookies were not left over, and the ribbon was chosen with purpose, and the 5 were the most carefully made of all the ones she baked that evening, selected last, packed with the attention of someone who has already decided and is now waiting, as patiently as she is able, to be understood. He knows all of this now, and has for many years, and the knowing has not diminished any of it. If anything, time has added something, the way a room slowly fills with evening light until the whole space is warm without anyone having turned on a lamp. And somewhere in a drawer, perhaps, the notebook still waits, the one she started with the simple instruction to write whatever came to mind, the one he filled with careful sentences and their small, repeated ending, the one their daughter read one quiet evening at the low table while the mother appeared in the doorway, and the house smelled faintly of dinner, and the light was the particular soft light of an ordinary evening. It rests there quietly, the way the best things do, not demanding to be opened, not requiring anything of anyone, simply present in its place, patient and worn and entirely itself, as familiar as the sound of the kettle in the morning, as warm as a light left on. And that, perhaps, is where this story rests tonight, in the soft space between what was counted and what was meant, between 5 cookies and a phrase written on a page, between a spring morning when a boy said something without quite meaning to and all the long, gentle years that followed after. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet echoes fading now like breath on cold glass, dissolving into the soft dark around you. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one, let your shoulders settle, let the weight of the day sink a little deeper into the stillness beneath you. Breathe slowly. You are safe, and the night is long, and there is time for everything. When you are ready, our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a gentle place, unhurried, full of the kind of warmth that lives in small things, a voice, a room, the faint scent of something familiar you can almost name. Somewhere in the long corridors of the inn, long after the sounds of the banquet hall had grown still, the night had settled into its own particular quietness, the kind that arrives only in old wooden buildings when the last guests have finally surrendered to sleep. The paper lanterns in the hallway glowed with a soft, warm light, and the polished floorboards reflected that warmth back in long, luminous lines, so that walking down the corridor felt a little like moving through shallow amber water. The others, one by one, had slipped away, some smiling, some shaking their heads with the mild good humor of late evenings, and the small, strange card game had wound itself down the way such things do, slowly and without fanfare. She was still a little unsteady on her feet, or so it seemed to him, and so he had suggested, almost without thinking, that they walk for a while in the cool night air before returning to their rooms. She had nodded and slipped on her sandals with the ease of someone who never makes anything more complicated than it needs to be, and together they had passed through the sliding screen door at the end of the corridor and stepped out into the inn's small garden. The garden was little more than a stone path winding between low moss and a single pine tree, but at midnight, with no one else awake, it held the quiet dignity of a much larger and more ancient place. The air was cool against their skin, the mountain air that such inns are built to receive, and she drew her yukata, the soft cotton robe the inn had provided, a little closer around her shoulders as they walked. He moved beside her along the stone path, close enough that their sleeves occasionally brushed against one another, and said nothing for a while, because the night did not seem to require conversation, and he had never been someone who filled silence simply for the sake of filling it. The sound of crickets rose from somewhere beyond the garden wall, a low and steady chorus that had been there all evening without anyone noticing, and somewhere further still, water moved quietly over stones in the dark. It was she who finally spoke, and what she said was not what he had been expecting. She noted, quite calmly, as though she were commenting on something of mild interest, that she had observed something particular about the way he had played at the card table, something that had struck her as rather too convenient, the cards falling in his favor again and again with a consistency that luck alone could not quite account for. He stopped walking, and in the pause that followed he heard only the crickets and the distant water and the soft presence of her waiting beside him. He considered denying it. The impulse arrived naturally, the way such impulses do, but something about the night air, or perhaps the way she was watching him with that patient, unhurried expression, made a denial feel small and unworthy. He admitted it, quietly and without elaboration, that he had arranged things the way such things sometimes get arranged when a person has a particular reason to want a particular outcome. She nodded slowly, and her expression carried the calm of someone arriving at a conclusion she had already been leaning toward for some time. And then she told him, in that same unhurried way of hers, that she had not been as intoxicated as everyone in the room had assumed, that somewhere in the middle of the game, the evening's drinks had simply worn away and left her quite clear-headed, watching everything with perfect clarity. He absorbed this in the careful way a person absorbs information that quietly reorganizes something they thought they understood. She had known, then, that he was cheating at cards. She had known, and she had said nothing, and she had let him win. She nodded, almost to herself, a small affirmation requiring no further elaboration, and then she turned her eyes back to the stone path ahead of them. He found himself thinking that she had been attending to things very carefully, long before he had realized there was anything to attend to. He asked her, the words coming out more directly than he had planned, but tiredness has a way of stripping away the careful management of things, why she had made that reckless bet in the first place, knowing what she was putting at risk. She was quiet for a moment, and then she answered slowly that she had not been thinking about risk in the way he meant it, that the moment had seemed amusing, and that she had trusted the people around her rather more than the situation perhaps deserved. He replied gently that not everyone in that room had seen it quite as simply as she had, that there had been one person, at least, who had taken the whole affair considerably more seriously than the mood of the evening warranted. Her expression shifted. In the quiet way understanding shifts a face, a slight softening around the eyes, a small settling in the line of her mouth. She asked which one, And he told her, the man who had been sitting to her right, the one who had been watching her not the way you watch a card game but the way you watch something you have wanted for a long time and have been waiting for a reason to claim. She was silent after that for a little while, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable but full in the way a room feels after something true has been spoken within it. She murmured that she had not noticed, and there was a quality in her voice that made clear she was genuinely taken aback, that she had moved through the evening with the open trust of someone who had not yet encountered a reason to do otherwise. He found himself wanting to preserve that quality in her, that willingness to walk into a room and assume the best of it, even as he recognized that the world did not always deserve such generosity. He told her, as plainly as he could manage, that she should be a little more careful with herself, not as a lecture, not unkindly, but in the way a person speaks when they mean something and haven't found a more graceful way to say it. She listened, and she looked at the path for a moment, and then she looked back up at him with the expression of someone who has heard the words perfectly well but is, just now, more interested in the thing that lives underneath them. The stone path had brought them, without their noticing, to a low bench near the garden wall, and without discussing it they both simply sat, the cool stone beneath them, the night spread wide and clear above. The inn rose behind them in layers of dark wood and pale paper, its windows all extinguished now, the other guests long since asleep in their futon rooms, the whole building held in the particular quiet that only very old places know how to keep. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the space between the garden stones, turning over in his mind the things he might say and the reasons he had carried, all this time, for not saying them, reasons that had accumulated slowly over months of careful silence. She sat beside him, unhurried and still, in the way water is still when it is running deep rather than shallow. He had spent a long time being cautious about exactly this kind of moment, the moment where something needed to be said or forever remain unsaid, and now that the moment was here, it felt less frightening than all that carefulness had implied it would be. He was still arranging himself when she leaned, just slightly, toward him and touched her lips very briefly and very lightly to the side of his face, not to his lips but to his cheek, just there, at the quiet edge of things. He went very still, the way a person goes still when something wholly unexpected occurs and the body, before the mind has caught up, simply waits. She settled back to where she had been, and she was smiling, not her wide, bright office smile, but something smaller and more private, a smile that seemed to belong entirely to the midnight garden and to no one else. She told him softly that this quality he had of arriving into a difficult situation and making himself quietly useful without being asked, was one of the things she liked about him. And then, because she was someone who did not leave important things half completed, she added that she had liked him for a long time now, longer than this evening, longer than their shared sales trip, from somewhere close to the beginning of knowing him. He heard this and felt it settle somewhere in the vicinity of his chest with a warmth he had not anticipated, a warmth that spread the way warmth spreads from a cup of tea held in both hands on a cold morning, slow and even and reaching. She recalled, her voice still low and unhurried, that she had tried to make this known over the months in small ways, in the kinds of gestures that are obvious to everyone except the person they are intended for, and that he had not appeared to notice any of them. He admitted, with some honesty and some embarrassment, that he had not noticed, that he had been so occupied with the effort of keeping himself composed around her that he had entirely missed what she had been trying to tell him. She observed that this was perhaps the most characteristic thing she could imagine about him, that he would work so hard not to be awkward that he would fail entirely to notice she had found his particular kind of carefulness endearing from the very start. He looked at the pine tree, and she laughed, very softly, and the sound drifted out into the night and was absorbed by the darkness above the garden wall. The crickets continued their steady song, indifferent to the small human drama on the bench beside the garden path, and somewhere in the dark a frog made a single brief announcement and fell quiet again. He told her then, the words arriving in a slightly different order than he had rehearsed them, but arriving nonetheless, that he had been drawn to her from the very first morning she had appeared in the office, bright and certain and entirely unaware of how thoroughly she had rearranged his carefully maintained equilibrium. He told her that he had gradually grown easier at breathing in her presence, and that this had seemed remarkable to him, because he had never in his life grown easier around anyone. He told her that the sales presentation had gone well partly because she had been there beside him, and that the evening afterward, the small izakaya, the mismatched plates of food, the absurd business with the chopstick lottery, had been the finest evening he could remember in a long time, not for any of those things in particular, but simply because she had been the one sitting across from him. He said all of this looking at the garden rather than at her, because some confessions are more manageable when made to the middle distance, and she listened without interrupting, which was, he had come to realize, one of the many things she was quietly and consistently good at. When he finished, she was still for a moment, and then she slipped her arm through his gently, in the manner of someone who has been waiting for exactly the right moment and has decided, at last, that this one will do. It was a small gesture, the linking of arms on a garden bench at midnight, but it altered the shape of the evening entirely, and he sat very still for a moment, simply adjusting to this new arrangement of things, before allowing himself to relax into the plain and uncomplicated warmth of it. She said that they should probably go back inside. It was very late, she noted, and the morning would arrive on its own schedule regardless of their preferences, and she had a window seat on the coach home and intended to use it for sleeping. He agreed, and they stood together, and the bench released them to the path, and they walked back the way they had come, her arm still in his, their steps unhurried on the cool garden stones. At the sliding screen door she paused and told him, with a composure entirely at odds with the content of what she was saying, that she expected proper attentiveness from him going forward, that she had expended considerable effort trying to be noticed and did not intend to mount that effort a second time. He promised, and she studied him for a moment the way she sometimes studied a problem at work, with focused, patient calm, and then nodded, apparently satisfied, and drew the door open. In the amber light of the corridor, she looked different than she did at the office, softer, without the particular brightness of the working day, simply herself in a borrowed cotton robe in a hallway at midnight, the lantern warmth lying quietly across her face. He walked her to the door of her room, because it seemed right, and at the door she turned and looked at him with that small, private smile once more. She said good night, and he said good night, and the door slid closed, and he stood in the corridor for a moment afterward, listening to the inn settling around him in its old wooden way, a soft creak from somewhere above, the building adjusting itself to the cool of the late mountain night. He walked back to his own room through the glowing corridor and lay down on the futon that had been prepared for him, cool cotton, a faint scent of cedar, the sound of the mountain night moving quietly beyond the paper screen, and he looked at the ceiling for a while without sleeping, simply existing in the altered shape of the evening. In the weeks and months that followed, the night at the inn became something they returned to sometimes, on quiet evenings, mostly, over dinner or on the way home, and each time it had the quality of a story told often enough to have softened into something comfortable and warm. Their colleagues, it would emerge, had observed everything long before either of them had spoken a word about it, the way she sought him out for questions she did not strictly need answered, the way he became, in her company, a version of himself that seemed easier to inhabit. The man who had once gone rigid at the sound of a woman's voice directed at him across a desk had become, without quite marking the change, someone who could sit across a table and talk for hours, as long as the right person was sitting there with him. She called it a miracle sometimes, with her characteristic lightness, and he called it a coincidence, and somewhere between those two interpretations the truth of it rested, that a company trip and a card game and a walk in a midnight garden had conspired to bring two people to the same stone bench, where something was finally said that needed saying. There had been a bet made in the course of that evening, a laughing, reckless thing that she would later regard with fond embarrassment, and the outcome of that bet had been not quite what anyone had planned for, but perhaps what the evening had been quietly moving toward from the beginning. He had won by cheating, and she had let him win, and in the years that followed they would occasionally and warmly disagree about who had been the more strategically minded about the whole affair, he maintaining it had been simple protectiveness, she maintaining, with the confidence of someone who has thought about it for considerably longer, that things had unfolded more or less as she had always intended. The truth was probably somewhere between the two, the way most truths are, two people moving towards something without quite admitting it, and finding it anyway, in the amberlit corridors and the cool garden of a mountain inn. The wedding was planned for May, and a number of the people who had been present that evening were invited, and several of them, in their speeches, mentioned a card game with the warm imprecision of people who remember not the facts of a story but only its feeling. He stood at the front of the room on the day of the ceremony with the quiet bearing of a man who has come to understand that some things which unsettle a carefully maintained order are not disruptions but gifts, that the right arrival does not destroy the equilibrium one has been tending, but simply reveals, at last, what it was tending for. And in the end, perhaps, the simplest version of the story was this, that she had been paying attention from the very beginning, and that he, in his careful and unknowing way, had been doing everything right without realizing that anyone was watching. The inn still stands somewhere in its mountain valley, one imagines, the pine tree patient beside the stone path, the bench cool and unchanged through all the seasons that have come and gone, the lanterns lit each evening in the long corridor as they have always been lit. And somewhere in that quiet garden, on that bench, at that hour when the rest of the world had gone to sleep and the crickets were the only ones still keeping time, this part of the story simply rests, the water still moving over stones in the dark, the night doing what the night has always done, holding things gently, and letting them be. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows folding quietly into the dark the way all things eventually do, without hurry, without ceremony. There is no need to hold on to it. You are allowed, now, to simply breathe a long, slow breath, deeper than the last, your body sinking a little further into the warmth that surrounds you. There is nowhere to be. Nothing waiting. Only this soft pause between one story and the next, like the space between waves before they reach the shore. When you are ready, and there is truly no rush, our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a quieter kind of tale, gentle as the feeling of an old familiar place you hadn't thought of in years. Somewhere in the slow middle of an ordinary life, there arrives a moment so quiet in its arrival that a person nearly misses it, and yet it is precisely this quality, this unannounced way of coming in, that allows it to stay. His name was Kazuichi, and by his own mild assessment he was a man whose life had followed most of the usual lines without significant detour, a school he remembered as adequate, a university that drew him south to Tokyo, a company that absorbed him in the unremarkable way of companies that take on many young men each spring and keep the ones who don't cause difficulty. He would have said, if asked, that he was content with all of this, that a life without exceptional suffering was its own quiet form of good fortune, and he meant it in the straightforward way of someone who has genuinely arrived at a thing and not merely settled for it. None of it was remarkable, in the ordinary sense, and he had made a kind of warmth for himself inside the unremarkable, the way a person learns, over enough time, to find the interesting corners of a room one has occupied for many years. Still, one part of his life had moved a little differently than most. When he was small enough to absorb changes without fully understanding them, his parents had separated, and he had gone with his mother, and his father had become the kind of absence that widens gradually, year by year, until one day it is simply permanent, and he had not been unhappy about this. It was only the shape of how things had arranged themselves, and children, in their particular mercy, are often better than adults at accepting shapes. Some years later his mother had remarried, and the announcement had arrived with one small detail that gave him pause. The man she was marrying had a daughter older than Kazuichi by several years, which meant that Kazuichi, an only child who had developed no instinct for siblings, no vocabulary for that particular closeness, was about to have one. Her name was Yomeko, and when he first met her at the initial gathering that felt more like a careful inspection than a meal, he registered that she had a face arranged with some care and a manner entirely at ease with itself, as though she had arrived already decided about most things and saw no particular reason to revise. He had been stiff with her in those early weeks, uncertain of the right distance, uncertain of the vocabulary for this, but she had not seemed to notice the difficulty, or had noticed and chosen to proceed without acknowledging it, talking to him as she would have talked to anyone, and in this way they had become close. They grew up together in the particular way that step-siblings do, alongside each other rather than quite together, building a shared history from the smaller ingredients of common meals and quiet evenings and the mild, habitual ease of people in proximity. By the time he left for Tokyo, she had been so long a part of the furniture of his life that her absence left a specific shape, though he would simply have said she was his sister, and meant it in the full ordinary sense, and that would have been enough. She had been talking about visiting Tokyo for years, a standing thread in their occasional telephone calls, this promise of a visit that never quite materialized into actual dates, and so when the message came one evening saying she was genuinely coming, and could he put her up for a few days, he felt something a little sharper than the mild pleasure of anticipated company, though he did not investigate the sharpness. He went to meet her at Tokyo Station on the Sunday she had named, standing in the long slow drift of arriving passengers, and when he spotted her coming through the barrier with a bag considerably larger than he had imagined, something in the afternoon seemed to settle, in the way a familiar melody settles when the missing note finally arrives. She was a little different from the Yomeko he carried in memory, not changed so much as deepened, the way a voice sounds when a person has grown fully into it, and they spent the day in the comfortable aimlessness of people who have known each other too long to need an itinerary to feel at ease. Over coffee in a small place near the shopping street, he asked her, with the directness that belongs only to people who have known each other through many weather systems, whether there was anyone in her life, and she was quiet for a moment before telling him there was no one in particular, letting the sentence end there, at a small and deliberate distance from something else. That evening, returned to his apartment, a single room in the way that Tokyo rooms so often are, shaped by efficiency rather than generosity, he realized he had not quite thought through the logistics of housing a woman overnight in a space designed for one. She moved through his small rooms with the easy authority of someone entirely comfortable in small spaces, and the apartment rearranged itself around her presence in a way he noticed without quite knowing he was doing the noticing, and when he mentioned, with mild logistical awkwardness, that there was no separate dressing area, she dismissed this as entirely uncomplicated. She disappeared behind the corridor door, and the small domestic sounds from the other side, the sounds of a person preparing for an evening bath, settled through the quiet room with a quality he had not anticipated, something almost electrical, something more attentive than it had any right to be. He did not read very much of the book he was holding. When his own turn came, he stepped into the familiar small space of his bathroom and found it quietly transformed. The air held the sweetness of her shampoo, carried from home, and the steam was still warm from her bath. And the mixture of the familiar and the unfamiliar made him stand still for a moment before turning on the water, taking a kind of inventory he could not have articulated. Later, with the lamp off and the city making its low sound beyond the window, she spoke from the futon in the tone she had always reserved for the mild mischief she directed at him, an oblique question that could be taken as a joke if one preferred to take it that way, and he answered in the same easy register. And they talked like this for a while, their voices unhurried, with the particular openness that belongs to late nights between people who have known each other long enough not to need to manage themselves. He would think about that conversation afterward, not so much its content as its texture, the way her voice sounded in his apartment at night, how easily it seemed to settle there, as though it had been present in the room before and was simply returning to something it already knew. She fell asleep before him, and he lay listening to the gradual quieting of her breath as it slowed into the long rhythm of rest, and he told himself a number of sensible things about who they were to each other, and then a few more, and eventually the accumulation of sensible things gave way, as it always does, to sleep. The next morning was a Monday, which meant work, and he dressed quietly in the early light while she slept, and she stirred only as he was nearly ready to leave, warm with sleep, slower than usual, looking at him from the futon with the unhurried expression of someone still half in a dream, and she told him softly to have a good day. He went out into the morning city carrying that small exchange with him through the hours of work, the simplicity of it, the weight it had, which was not small at all, and he moved through his day with the slightly distracted quality of someone whose inner weather has shifted in a way they haven't yet fully assessed. That evening she sent word she had gone for a drink alone and would be home later, and he sat at his low table with cans from the Conveni, the little convenience store at the end of his street, and the quiet of a man waiting in the manner he told himself was not waiting. She arrived home with the warm looseness of someone who had been thinking through something alongside the drinking, and when she noticed his own cans on the table she observed with gentle reproach that he might have waited, and he said something in return, and the room filled with the easy warmth of their particular way of talking. She noticed, or had perhaps known already, that some part of him had been listening more carefully than he had let on, and she named this with the mild accuracy that comes from years of knowing a person's silences as well as their words. What happened later that night he would hold in his memory with a quality close to wonder, not the flush of triumph, not the weight of regret, but the soft bewilderment of someone who has found themselves further along a path than they had known they were walking, looking back at the distance with a kind of wondering quiet. In the morning she was still sleeping when he slipped out for work, and he went about his hours carrying the previous night in the way one carries something delicate attentively, without quite looking directly at it, placing each hour down with the care of someone on unfamiliar ground. He returned that evening to find her in his kitchen, moving with the settled ease of someone who has decided to be at home in a space, something simmering on the low flame with a smell that reached back through years to the kitchens of his childhood. She looked up when he came in and said something small and ordinary about his having arrived, and her manner was unchanged. She was entirely herself, as she always was, and he felt in response something complicated, relief, and underneath the relief something else he could only allow himself to observe sideways, without turning to face it directly. They ate together at the low table, and the food was good and she was easy to talk to in the way she had always been, and the city went on outside the window, and then, in what seemed like an unremarkable pause in the conversation, she set down her bowl and told him there was something she had been meaning to say. She mentioned, in a careful voice, that an arrangement was being made for her back home, a formal meeting, the kind that families set up when the informal kind have not produced results over the years, and she said it to the table rather than to him, with the measured restraint of someone delivering one true thing while holding a second true thing very carefully in reserve. She spoke about her age, and about it probably being time to move towards something settled, and she said all of this with her eyes on the bowl in front of her, and then she looked up and told him the second true thing. She told him that she had felt for him, for more years than she could quite account for, something that ran deeper than the ordinary warmth of siblings, something that had come in quietly, she was not sure exactly when, and had remained through all the ordinary years and ordinary rooms and ordinary telephone calls, without once offering to leave. She had always known this feeling was not one she could follow. The shape of their relationship had been established long before either of them had any say in it, and she had tried to make her peace with this, had been trying for years, and the arranged meeting had felt like a way to finally, formally, set the feeling down and leave it. She had come to Tokyo, she told him, not only to see the city, but to say this once, so that it could exist in words for a single moment, so that she could let it go and go home and step forward into whatever came next without the weight of something never said. He sat with this for a long breath, feeling the years of what she had carried, the patient dailiness of bearing something like that quietly, through all the ordinary spaces they had shared, through all the easy conversations, without once letting it show in any direction. And then he told her that he had been carrying the same thing, or something very much like it, for approximately as long. He said it plainly, in the way one states something that has been quietly true for so long that making a production of it would only be a distraction from the truth itself. And then he reached across the table and took her hands, and her hands were trembling, the small involuntary trembling of something long held tightly, finally allowed to rest. He asked her, very quietly, whether she would be his wife. She was still for a moment that felt longer than it was, and then she began to cry, not dramatically, not with any performance, but with the gradual release of someone from whom a long-held tension has been gently lifted, and through the crying she laughed, the two things arriving together in the way of feelings too large to be contained by any single expression. She told him it felt invented, something too neatly shaped to have occurred naturally in actual life, and he said he had thought exactly this, and she leaned toward him, and the lamp was warm, and the city outside continued its low, continuous thing, and they stayed like that in the quiet of his small apartment while the evening grew late around them. They told their parents in the weeks that followed, with the patient honesty of people who have decided on something true and are willing to sit with the difficulty of explaining it, and gradually, in the imperfect, incremental way of families navigating the genuinely unexpected, the people who needed to understand came to understand. They married the following year on a mild autumn day and took an apartment near a small park, a proper place this time, with rooms and a hallway and a bathroom with a door that actually closed, and she moved her life to Tokyo, and her life in Tokyo suited her in the visible way of things that have found their right shape. Their days acquired the small, reliable textures of shared domesticity, the morning coffee, the evening conversations about nothing much that accumulated over months and then years into something that felt, in the end, remarkably like everything. There was an evening, not long after they had settled in, when she called from the bathroom to say the shampoo had run out, and he found the refill in the cabinet and carried it down the hallway, and she opened the bathroom door just a few inches to take it from him, and he looked away with a reflex so automatic it surprised even himself, the old reflex, installed by years of being her brother, which no amount of marriage had yet managed to fully overwrite. She asked him, warm and gently amused from behind the door, why he still did that after everything, and he told her to be quiet and closed the door and stood for a moment in the hallway, aware of the precise quality of what he was feeling, the fondness and the mild comedy of being, after all, still himself, still partly the boy who had never quite learned how to have a sister. He thought sometimes, in the quiet of ordinary evenings, about those 3 days she had spent in his single room, the awkward logistics of it, the late-night conversation in the dark, the morning she had stood at the apartment door and said something so small and so right that he had carried it through the entire working day without knowing quite what to do with its weight. 3 days in which everything that had been quietly accumulating for years had simply come to the surface, not through any drama, not through any single decisive moment, but through the gradual, unhurried emergence of something that had always been there, needing only enough time and a small room and the sound of rain to finally become visible. He had always expected his life to be the ordinary kind, and it had been, and it still was, in most of the ways that counted, and somehow inside all of that ordinary life this had been growing for years, while he was doing other things, while both of them were elsewhere, neither of them quite looking at it. Not a transformation, not a discovery, a recognition. The warm, slightly bewildering recognition of someone who looks around at the life they have and finds, with some surprise, that it is exactly what they would have chosen if they had known enough to choose it. And here now was an evening in their apartment, the lamp making its soft circle on the table, the rain beginning gently against the window, her voice from somewhere in the other room, and the quiet, ordinary, unhurried weight of a life that had arrived by the longest possible route and felt, for that very reason, entirely right. That, perhaps, is where the story rests tonight, in a small apartment in a city that hums, where the lamp is warm and the rain is soft, and two people who took the long way around have found, in all the ordinary quiet of a shared evening, something that feels very much like home. And so we come to the end of tonight's stories. The voices have grown quiet now. The last tale has been told, and all that remains is the stillness you've been drifting toward all this while.